All right, we are on the mic. Today we have one of our new panel guests, Daniel, or DP, as we call him generally. So what's on our agenda today, Dwight?
We got public intellectuals, we got the national debt, we got guns, internet censorship, and the climate.
Oh my, that's a big one.
There's a lot.
All right, where do you guys want to start?
I think we should start with public intellectuals since we've been kind of talking about that all morning already.
That's fair. That's fair.
So,
were we starting with intellectual dark web?
I think
Sure,
I think it's good to define who we're talking about.
Yes, so let's define what the intellectual dark web is. So I mean, my understanding of it is it's essentially a network of public intellectuals that kind of there's a lot of them appearing on each other's shows and discussing topics together. It should be noted that they've gotten some attacks from the mainstream media. So like the New York Times put out an article about them, essentially saying there's a lot of connection to like the alt-right and stuff like that through that network. I think there's a little truth in that, but I think it's generally just kind of an attack on non-mainstream, political narratives.
yeah, I would say that that's probably an effort to put them in a box and say,
For sure.
don't listen to these
And they're
guys.
doing that on both sides of the political spectrum,
Yeah.
where they're like, you're not complying with the mainstream, narrative, so you're not allowed.
And that's really what I would say defines them, is the fact that they're sort of willing to talk about almost anything.
True.
They don't seem to be afraid of the recourse that might come from the norm.
And that's why they're so popular, is because a lot of people are looking for that unfiltered discussion of the difficult issues of the day. That's a really important point.
Yeah.
And I think we should have more people across the political spectrum wanting to be part of that conversation rather than trying to silence it.
Yep.
And that's going to get into censorship in general, which is a big problem right now.
Definitely.
But you guys probably listen to the people in this particular category more than I do. So why don't you guys go ahead and describe some of the members?
Yeah, I mean, number one, the intellectual dark web actually has a website. So,
really?
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
You can go on and see everyone who's in it, but it contains like people like, what's Ruben's first name?
Oh, Dave Rubin.
Dave Rubin. It has Joe Rogan in it. He's technically in it. Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, the Weinstein brothers, so Eric and Bret. Bret's wife,
Heather Heng.
We should say we're going to be getting more into the substance of each of these people, because I definitely come from a much more left-wing perspective, and a lot of these people I strongly disagree with a lot of their positions. But
totally. But I think one of the coolest things, I recommend anyone who's listening to definitely check them out, because they're very intelligent people who are willing to really go deep into like the minutia of all of the conversations that are happening, like socially and stuff like that. Because one of the reason why I like them is there's a lot of social issues that are going on right now that I feel are very polarized and not very deep, and they're not looking for how to compromise or how to actually do anything about it. It seems like more of a tribe mentality,
right,
where they're trying to just fight each other.
The other group down.
And these guys actually talk about, just recently I saw one where Eric Weinstein was on Rubin, and the big thing that he said was he wants to get the dark web to now talk about how to actually fix the issues by steel manning the opposite side, which is another huge thing that they've contributed to.
It's a really,
the whole...
really good development.
Exactly.
In terms of political debate.
Totally. And actually, he's trying to hold the others accountable, too.
So, for those listening, steel man, the idea is, as opposed to straw man, where you recreate your opponent's argument in a intentionally weak and dishonest way to undermine their position. Steel man is you try to present their opinion in the strongest way possible so that the two parties can agree on that position, and then you start from that position of strength of argument to have your debate, and it's a lot healthier.
Totally.
But anyway.
So, yeah, I mean, that was the other really big thing that I think is important, I was thinking about this, is that the discussions are continuous, and they are constantly updating. So if someone comes up with a good idea, they're like, oh man, we're the whole idea of steel manning, that wasn't necessarily I don't even know if philosophically that's a term, but they keep creating new terms that they like to use in a way that they think progresses discussion.
And I think that's an excellent example of where that is true.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a good development. I've included that in my own vernacular now.
Totally. So That's like, I was thinking about it in terms of, these are, for me, I see them as like the philosophers of our time. And so they are, one of the cool things is it's not like they wrote a book that you'll later come back, that you'll read, like Plato's Republic or something like that, and then you'll be able to critique it. It's like they are constantly critiquing their own arguments and each other's arguments, and you get to see them develop. So they're not like, they're never like, this is the truth. They're like, we're going to continue talking about this until we can get to the truth. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's really inspiring.
So, go ahead, Dwight.
It looks like that Steel Man comes from Daniel Dennett originally. Possibly.
Okay, yeah.
So one thing that
modern day philosophy
that I definitely have a critique of the intellectual dark web is that I think the strongest left-wing philosophers of our time, none of them are included, and I think that does tilt the discussion in a right-wing direction. So like the left-leaning people in the intellectual dark web, so like Sam Harris or Bret Weinstein, I think those people are more establishment in their left-wing views. Whereas, like, the more leftist people, so say Noam Chomsky, Chris Hedges, Richard Wolff, people like that aren't part of this network. And a lot of times I find people in this network making arguments that I wish, I just want to see debates happen with these people. So, actually, Richard Wolff just put out a challenge to debate Jordan Peterson anytime, anywhere on Marxism.
Ooh, that'd be cool.
So I hope that happens.
That'd be awesome.
That'd be really cool.
Yeah, I mean, the big thing that I've seen is most all of the people within the intellectual dark web they call themselves centrists. So
yeah, I noticed that.
They are not going to be your extremists or obviously the more progressive, the most progressive people, right. I guess. But they're really trying to hold on to the like actual discussion between the two sides.
Right.
So you do get, and they're obviously more like on the intellectual side of things. They're not. They do try, I guess they go into social ideas, like, the more, like, transgender or something like that, but it's not necessarily, like, let's reevaluate our whole capitalistic system, or let's reevaluate these really underpinning things for society.
I mean, we should elaborate that people like Jordan Peterson, talks extensively about things like Marxism, why
he
thinks
bad.
that doesn't work, why he thinks
right.
it's psychologically bad.
Yeah.
And so to not include, the foremost Marxist professor in the United States in that discussion, I think is a huge blind spot.
Well, it's also, it doesn't seem to me like they're purposely excluding them.
Yeah, exactly. No, for sure.
So
exactly.
Don't get me wrong. I don't think that's
they're talking to people that they can and that are around, and then I'd be interested to see if Jordan Peterson does.
Dude, I would be very surprised if he didn't, because if a reporter comes from somewhere and is like, I want to talk to you, he's usually pretty open to at least having an online discussion. So
it seems much to his chagrin, he's regretted, because some of these reporters are just trying to do a hack job. So.
Yeah.
Well, who decides like who's part of the intellectual dark web?
I don't think there's like a decision.
Who's the coined?
I think it's just an association of people.
I mean, it's kind of in groupy. They talk.
Weinstein coined the term.
Yeah, and they talk about people. Okay, normally a really big one is like they get pilloried, which is like basically
What's that?
Pilloried is another term that they say is like they get pilloried by the media. So the idea is that they've said something extreme, and then there's some social media or like establishment media that interviews them and tries to destroy them by like strawmanning their arguments, but also trying to associate them with like these
extremists.
Super extreme negative extremists.
Yeah.
And then they're like, they usually do really well in arguing the opposite of that. So like defending themselves and being able to be in a like logical frame of mind. So like the idea that Bret was like had students come into his room and like call him all of these like call him a racist, and they were literally like they were protesting in his classroom while he was giving a lecture, and then he actually talked him down. Exactly. Same with Jordan Peterson, who was really against the hate crime bill C-16 in Canada, and there was a bunch of protests at the school, and all of the people he would try to have a conversation with and be like, I'm not racist. I'm not a terrible person. This is why I think this is an impingement of freedom of speech, and it's not okay. And that's why I'm not going to do it.
Well, give a little background on, what was that incident about?
The C-16 one?
Yeah.
Okay, so C-16 was a bill that was put forth in Canada about attaching the compulsory speech of individuals who were speaking to a transgendered individual who wanted to be called
So
by
you have to
their
use
chosen
the
name.
term that they've chosen.
Exactly.
And you're saying that's an infringement on freedom of speech because you're requiring me to
Exactly.
say certain things.
And it was the big thing for him was that it was clearly that either the individuals who wrote the law didn't understand the implications of it, or they were directly being like untruthful about what it was, because they were like, oh, you won't get any jail time by it, and he was like, no, you literally will get jail time. You can fine me if I don't. You can, like, because of the way the hate crime laws that were created, you could literally face jail time for just not calling someone something that they wanted to be called.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy.
So he was just like, no, this isn't okay. And like, it's
different than like going out and like verbally assaulting someone. That's like, I was just minding my own business, and you're saying I have to use certain words when I speak to you.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because Jordan Peterson and Bret Weinstein sort of share that in that they sort of share that narrative in that they got rocketed into like their fame by these controversial incidents. So Jordan Peterson was opposing that bill. Bret Weinstein and his wife Heather Heng were opposing the idea that at Evergreen College they had this day of absence that was a tradition from like the 1970s or something, where all the people of color would just not show up for class one day, and the administration wanted to flip that and say that all of the white people were not able to show up for class that day.
Right.
And so Bret Weinstein and his wife both spoke out against that, and they were like, this is racist and I'm not going to do it. And they got, that's where these protests happened, and they essentially got ran out of the college, and they ended up settling with the college.
Yeah, that's an interesting dilemma, because it seems the whole thing started with the idea of like, a movement among students of color to say, a day of absence where we're not going to come to school so you can feel the absence of, that diverse section of the community, because we've been historically disenfranchised, so it's kind of like a political statement.
It came from a play, also. I can't remember the name of the play, but there's a play that all the black people in the town decided not to show up for the day, and that wreaked havoc and whatnot.
Yeah, which is, I think that's great.
Yeah.
But the idea of telling a group of people they can't come to school, obviously that's crossing the line.
And there were a bunch of other
no matter what
things.
group it is, telling them they can't is, I think, unacceptable.
There were a bunch of other little things that came out about that whole thing later, where there would be some sort of gathering where a white person would come in and they would not be allowed to sit in certain places or eat certain types of food. Well, and it's just like, how is that even remotely okay?
I think this is like the coolest part for me for like the intellectual dark web is that they've shown that this idea of progressive movements, of like social movements, there is this underlying like concern for people's rights that goes to the point of impinging on other people's rights, where these like really liberal leaning people don't realize that they're getting into like fascist tendencies.
Or they do.
So,
I think just authoritarian.
Okay,
be careful with saying fascist.
Sure, fine, authoritarian,
right?
Fine.
Yeah.
Then I think that's better. So, but it's
very authoritarian.
Very.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong. I'm hugely anti-authoritarian, as anyone who's been listening so far would know.
Which, I can't imagine that if you went up and talked to those individuals and said you're being an authoritarian, they'd be like, oh yeah, I totally think that.
Right.
It's like almost always they're like coming from a place of like where they've gone through some shit, they feel like they've been like oppressed in some way, and they feel like they want to, make everything even in that egalitarian way. But to the point where it is an authoritarian, it's an enforced.
Right, and I definitely want to get into that when I have like a deep dive I want to do on some of my disagreements with Jordan Peterson, which will go into some of this stuff and that development on the left. But I don't know if I really want to do that yet because I don't want to hog it. But
well, unless anyone else has anything to say right now, I would say that's fine.
I mean, Daniel and Sean, have you guys listened to these guys much? Like, who have you guys listened to?
I know Joe Rogan and Sam Harris, and then the brothers. But yeah, some of these people I haven't even heard of.
Yeah.
So I just need to do.
And I've just recently heard of
research.
them for sure.
It sounds like the problem is that they're getting put into these boxes. When
Right.
they're really, most of them are just in the middle, and they're just trying to understand the world.
Well, and I think the biggest thing is they're not to be put in boxes.
Yes.
yeah,
that's-
no one should.
That's one of the biggest things that I notice about them is there's two big things. One is that they constantly get misquoted and taken out of context, especially Sam Harris. I think he's the most commonly abused in that regard because he's and he actually sets himself up for it really, really well because he will go into these crazy thought experiments where he sets up this idea and he creates this extreme world and then he talks about what would happen in that world. And so then people just take what he said about without any of the setup and they say,
That's
oh,
what he wants
Sam
to.
Harris said we should nuke the Saudis. And
See?
it's like, that's not even close to what he said at all.
So that's going to be something we're going to talk about later, because I do think he gets into some really irresponsible issues sometimes. But
And I think he's becoming aware of that because, like,
I hope so.
They had some discussions with Jordan Peterson and him, and with
I
Bret
haven't watched those.
Weinstein.
That'd be
And
interesting.
oh yeah, you should, because that's again, this is like the adaptation that I'm talking about that they do. Is like Sam has looks at the crowd and says like, "Go ahead and misquote me on Twitter." It literally says like that kind of thing. It's like this is
So
going to be a
used to it.
section where they will try to misquote me.
Right.
So he's becoming aware. But,
Definitely. But the other thing that I was going to say about them is that they all do hold views that don't really fit into a box very well.
Mhm.
Especially
Yeah.
Sam Harris. I mean, I can't even say that.
You do
Especially
find a
all of them.
lot of, and that's kind of like opposed to the nature of the age we're in because it's so tribal, and
Yeah.
the idea of people holding views that are kind of, not easy to put on a team, I think makes people who are so team oriented very uncomfortable.
Definitely. And Sam Harris points out a really good thing about that. He's like, the fact that your views on healthcare can reliably predict your views on gun control is a problem because those are not related and they shouldn't be. And so, it makes it so that people get in this idea where they think they're a Democrat and they're like, okay, well, what do Democrats believe? And then they sort of adopt those beliefs and become this tribe when
Right.
it makes so much more sense to have views on either side in a lot of cases.
And that's what I see a lot with the two-party system that we have. Yeah, it's like if you're a Democrat, that means you want to get take everyone's guns away, which that shouldn't be that way. You should be able to own guns, be a Democrat. You should, I feel like it's caused a lot of divide within our country.
Yeah.
I agree.
But that is, like you said, is part and parcel to the political system we
Yep,
have.
definitely.
And, them steering their bases to be as angry at the other base as possible because that generates votes, and they're able to steer the debate by, getting people all riled up.
And it's
over
just what
certain
Trump
things.
said in his rally in Nevada, that Democrats are an angry, uncontrolled, unhinged mob.
Yeah, look in the mirror, buddy.
And it's like, Republicans are the same. That's a two-party system. You get two crazy mobs that just go after each other.
Well, and anyone who points to one side or the other as being the mob really weirds me out. Because, if you look, it's happening all over the country, like the clashes between Antifa and the Proud Boys. These are similar kinds of people or people reacting in a similar way, and they just have a different jersey on.
Yeah.
That's really
Exactly.
what
And
it
I
is.
think it harkens to why, the intellectual dark web is this coined phrase anyway. I mean, it's I think people who have ever been interested in a particular subject, if they've got the gumption, will pursue the intellectuals that have existed in the field already.
Definitely.
It's like these are convenient modern day ones packaged in mainstream media, and so we all have access to them. And I think what a bigger issue is why they're so popular, in this mainstream outlet. It must harken to this inherent desire of everyone
Definitely.
trying to find out more information, and I think it's cool that they're all there, and it's I listen to several of them. I listen to Jordan Peterson mainly, but I kind of slowed down on listening to them. You know what I mean? Because at the same time, I'm like, what am I looking for? You know what I mean by listening to these guys? I think it's why are these guys so popular for the masses? And it's that search. It's this there's this mass energy in our culture for trying to understand what's going on and have a better grip on it. And it's I don't know. I like what most of these guys are doing, and I like the format and like the discussions they're all having and stuff too. But I just worry it might lead down a path of just like, almost of like this false reverence for Jordan Peterson or something like that, where it's like, you now base all of your philosophy. Yeah.
Okay, something that's really concerning me.
Sorry, not to cut you off, but I just wanted to say they're definitely not in the mainstream media, though. That's kind of one of the things that makes them different. They all have podcasts and stuff. That they go on each other's podcasts. Like,
what are we defining as that then?
Like what I am seeing though is people who
mainstream media. Yeah, that's like CNN,
so
Fox,
TV nations, TV networks.
MSNBC.
So YouTube doesn't count as mainstream media.
No. So or if they're appearing on like mainstream journalistic outlets, so like Washington Post, New York Times.
Well, the idea is that these individuals put out their own videos on. Yes, they do. They choose a source to do that, which would be YouTube, because it is like one of the number one things. And then through their discussions or argumentations, people like them, so they watch them a lot, and they're like, "Oh, I agree with you. It's not doctored to be like this is the narrative," because like CNN, MSNBC, Fox, all are like, "This is what we're telling you is true."
If that was part of exclusively the definition of it, then I think we've all realized that
those are all invalidated.
That news, that corporate news outlets are very, very like not great.
And I would say that we in this room definitely, but
we should also say statistically, young people are recognized.
Okay, and statistically,
young people get most of their news from online sources, and I think it's like people over 45. I think get most of their news.
You mean
not? It's diversified, so they do get some of their news from those sources, but they also seek independent outlets.
Totally.
Because they're online and it's easy.
Yeah.
Whereas people, I think, 45 and over, were getting their news almost exclusively from cable news.
Right? Totally.
So that's that purely in wheelhouse, establishment narrative.
Yeah.
As opposed to adding the diversification of independent outlets.
For sure. What were you going to say about?
Yeah. So one of the things I've seen, and I don't think this is necessarily something that only these people are subject to. But there is a tendency to have people just kind of use these public intellectuals to justify tribalism they already had. So, like, I see a lot of people... So, like, one of the sites I follow, Democracy at Work, which anyone who's been following up to this point knows they advocate for the workplace to be co-owned and democratically run by the workers. I see people posting Jordan Peterson arguments against Marxism in there. So don't get me wrong, this view comes from a Marxist critique of capitalism.
Yeah,
but what they're saying is, you just want equality of outcome.
Right.
You just want equality of outcome, which is something Jordan Peterson hits all the time. But this particular point of view has nothing to do with equality of outcome.
Exactly.
It has nothing to do with any authoritarian structure of any kind.
Right.
But they're just saying, I'm on the right. I believe Marxism is bad. Jordan Peterson told me Marxism is bad. Here's a talking point. Anyone who says anything about Marx, here's my talking points, and you're on the other team.
Totally, and I feel like that's such a cherry picking of these individuals' ideas, just to recapitulate.
But I think that's also part of the concern that's happening. Is I think people are only seeing how people on what they've recognized as the other team are touting certain intellectual figures to perpetuate their tribal affiliation.
Right.
So that's an interesting problem as well.
I know, but that one I feel like is so difficult because all you can do is encourage the people to be like, okay, let me listen to who these people talk to. Because when they get together, you get people like, you'll get Jordan Peterson in with Bret Weinstein, in with Eric Weinstein, and they'll talk about those situations.
Or even Ben Shapiro, who's a Republican. But one thing I wanted to say about that is that I think using that as an argument against which it seems like that's framed as an argument against the intellectual dark web.
I don't think it is.
People do that shit all the time with everything. That's just people being retarded.
Exactly.
And you can't ascribe that to anything in particular. Like, just because... Yeah, they're being retarded. They're taking that argument out of context, and it doesn't mean anything in that context. I say that's retarded, personally. Because they don't understand what they're saying, and they're just parroting it back like it means something in this context when it doesn't. Right? So that to me is being stupid. Okay? So, I think...
For being politically correct, that's probably a better word. That's something.
That's the only thing.
Stupid, better than retarded.
I choose not to say it, but it's whatever.
It's like midget.
Because it is
Yeah.
like a disorder.
Well,
it's
we
like
can
a,
talk about
it's like
political
a
correctness on another one
disability
because
as
I
opposed to
avidly
being dumb.
disagree with political correct culture. So you'll hear that. when I
I'm
talk
mostly
a
disagreeing
lot.
with it. I think there's a little validity. But anyway.
Yeah. So anywho,
We're
what
sorry.
I'm saying,
If
what I'm
anyone
saying
got
though,
offended, we're
is just
sorry.
that I'm not sorry. Is that
We know. I still love you for it.
Great. I'm just saying that I don't think that's really a valid critique of Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, or any of these people
Definitely.
because that's just other people taking their views out of context and using them
Yeah.
for. And when people do that with anything. So.
Yeah, I do think that's where a big part of that concern is coming from. Is from within that tribal camp, seeing that and then trying to put you on the other team.
Yeah.
I do think these people should probably maybe speak a little bit more to like who their audiences are and maybe try and separate themselves from certain sects of it that they disagree with. I don't know if that's happening very much.
They've talked about how they've all been represented as like supporters of the alt-right, and they're all like, yeah, this is the reason why, and it's ridiculous.
See, it is interesting though, because like
they've not.
I don't want to talk to who this person is, but I know someone who's like pretty fascistic.
Yeah.
And like super right wing Trump, hardcore authoritarian right wing.
Yeah.
And I heard him not in a very intellectual way, but using some of the things Jordan Peterson said to justify his positions.
No, totally.
And so, that's going to happen no matter who we're talking about.
Exactly.
And it's just important for public intellectuals to speak directly if they
I agree.
see that association occurring.
But it's also interesting because what we were talking about earlier of kind of trying to get away from the idea of tribalism.
Yeah.
That's going back to a lot of it. It's saying like, oh, I don't support the alt-right. It's like, well, maybe you do in some cases. I don't think
more
that they.
specific than
I don't
saying
think
a
that
group
they.
like that.
Yeah, I don't think that they need to do that. I think they should be able to represent their own views, and wherever they match up with other people being crazy and tribal, I don't think that's their problem.
They are totally okay with saying they don't support anything alt-right, though.
Yeah,
they
they-
literally
okay.
will be like, they're like, because like, there's even like examples of Jordan Peterson on camera, because that's another huge thing, is like, he puts like his whole freaking life on camera.
Yeah.
But he's like at the Bill C-16 rallies, like for the transgender people attacking him, really was like, they were like, what do you say about Nazis being here? Are you a Nazi supporter? And he was like, no, I don't want Nazis here.
Yeah, I
if I
did see
find
that.
them, take them away.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want them here. And if anyone commits any violence, then I want them not here. That's
Yeah.
not okay. And it's just like,
So that's
yeah.
good. That's
But-
good shit.
But that, I mean, he said that on camera, and then you'll still see after that people sourcing him as like an
Right.
alt-right supporter. So it's
Well,
just,
and this happens across the board, and it can be very nefarious. So, I mean, like, they did the same thing during the 2016 election, is like, they would smear Bernie because,
Right.
certain Bernie supporters, they said, were, being sexist towards Hillary.
Totally.
There's this whole Bernie bro narrative. It's like, oh, you're a Bernie bro. You don't support Hillary, so you're sexist because you support Bernie. It's like, what are you talking about? I want universal health care and free college and not going to war and fixing climate change. Like, those are my issues.
Yeah.
And no corporate money in politics. That's why.
Yeah,
It's just
right.
like, yeah. Okay, so I'm a guy and I vote for Bernie, so I'm sexist. Okay, cool.
People do that kind of shit all the time, and they just want to push people's ideas off into a corner and
Yeah.
debase them. And that I think is a huge problem. But
We gotta have the facilities to be prepared to deal with challenging viewpoints too.
Yeah.
It's a reflex to do that.
Yes.
So you can't like blame them necessarily 100%.
definitely.
Again, it's like you hearken again to the bigger issue of these intellectual pursuits. It's like what are people trying to get out of like these intellectual pursuits?
Totally.
What do they need to validate in themselves? That's the thing. It's like everyone's seeking like this validation for their position,
Yes.
their philosophy, and this outlook on life. And it's like it's just like in our culture, it's like almost 95% an intellectual pursuit. And it's like I don't know. It's just like it's great to have like rational like discussions about stuff and like what are the individual like points of a dude and who is in the club of the intellectual dark web or whatever and who's not, and like why there is a distinction between that anyways, and there's already something weird going on with that, obviously, you know. So
it was originally very, very informal. Eric Weinstein was just talking about how there's sort of become this group of people that have been passing.
Well, if that's not how it started, that's not where it's at now. There is something kind of weird, you know. There's like a website.
Well, we want to say this has all happened in literally a year.
Yeah, so
and
there's
they
a lot
are
of
talking of each other like constantly. So they're like, we need a name for the we have this like on the mic. It's like we need a name for our thing that we do.
Yeah. It's an association of individuals.
It doesn't seem like it's exclusive.
One thing that bothers me about it though, when I say that I don't think there's sorry, what's that?
No, it's fine. Keep going.
So one thing that definitely bothers me about it when I was saying that I don't think there's a left-wing representation there is I don't think there's any individual in the intellectual dark web who's fundamentally anti-capitalist. And I think that's a huge fucking blind spot. They're all pro-capitalism. Every single one of them, even the ones who say they're left-wing. So that is a right-leaning overall perspective that I really wish was being challenged more, because there's an echo chamber in terms of saying capitalism is okay and good and we all agree. You know, it's just a matter of should it be more left-wing regulated or, you know, more free market, which is a closed dialogue that doesn't take into account the full spectrum of debate right now at all.
Yeah. Again, though, I think that's sort of an unfair criticism because it's not this contrived group. They didn't sit down and say, like, oh, we need to get people on all these issues that have different ideas.
I'm not even criticizing them or saying that that's their fault. Yeah. I'm just saying I would like to see that discussion evolve by including those perspectives.
That'd be cool. Yeah, for sure. None of these people are really economists, so I think that's part of the reason that hasn't happened. I mean, Eric Weinstein,
but they sure speak with a perceived authority on these subjects. So that's why either stay out of it or let's have a robust debate, and it has to include critics, or it's not a robust debate.
I haven't heard them talk too much about the economy personally, so I don't really know.
That's most of what it's an issue I'm really interested in, so that's actually most of what I've looked for, and it's mainly Jordan Peterson who gets into that. Weinstein has a bit too, but obviously Weinstein. Sorry,
Eric Weinstein is a pretty big authority on that because he manages Teal Capital, so he does know a lot about the economy. But obviously, he's probably more capitalistic.
Yeah.
But yeah, Jordan Peterson has definitely talked about Marxism and a critique of Marxism. So it would be great to hear Richard Wolff debate him on that, because I think his main critiques are sort of from a psychological basis, which makes sense. I mean, he's a psychologist, so
I'm stoked to get into that.
Let's hear it. Let's do it.
Daniel, what was that point you were going to make earlier? Did you get cut off?
I did, but let's just keep going.
Are you sure?
Yeah, I'm definitely, I'm understanding the format of this.
I mean, don't feel bad. Anyone jump in anytime.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
I got the vibe. Yeah.
Okay, so I did some like deep listening to Jordan Peterson in terms of his critiques of Marxism and all that, and so I definitely had some disagreements here. And I definitely want to talk to you, Drew, about this, because I know you spent a lot of time listening to Jordan Peterson. So let's see. He had a lot of points. Let's see. So one of the main issues he talks about is kind of like the idea of neo-Marxism, the merging of postmodernism and Marxism. And he talks about the idea that Marxism says that the accumulation of inequality of wealth is a flaw of capitalism. So he's talking about Marx saying that. And he says that that is incorrect. And he points to the Pareto principle, which is the idea that in any human endeavor, what is it, like 30% do 70% of the
It's like 10%
or something
do
like
like
that.
80% of the work, or something like that.
So when I was listening to him, he talked about how that's the fact that capitalism produces inequality is untrue, because that's going to happen in any human societal relation. So that's one of the things he talked about. And then, let's see. Oh, sorry.
Well, let's just talk about that.
Anyway, yeah. So that's something I really disagree with, his representation of that and whether that's accurate. Because what Marx talks about, he does say that it's the accumulation of wealth is a thing in capitalism. But what he points to more specifically is that this unequal accumulation of wealth and power within a society is a result of the hierarchical structure of societal relations. So saying that, in the workplace you have the manager and all the employees, and that represents the same structure as, say, lords and serfs in feudalism or masters and slaves in slavery.
Yeah.
And Marx points to the fact that we need to have relations that are non-hierarchical and authoritarian as the primary basis of societal relations. And so that's where the idea of, like, say, democratizing the workplace comes from.
Yeah.
And so, that's what Marx was arguing. And so I think that's something that really needs to be explored, is that whole idea of, is it necessary to have a society where power is controlled by the few as opposed to the many, and that kind of thing. So another thing he goes into is talking about how in the 60s, he says Marxism was totally invalidated because of everything going on in, like, communist Russia and all these different things. And because it was invalidated, there was kind of like a switching of language. And this is where it gets into, like, feminism and all of that.
Yeah. Postmodernism.
Right. So what's your understanding of postmodernism, Drew?
So postmodernism is the idea that there's no real, like, structure to anything. It's that the only structures are power structures.
Right.
So the idea that, like, there will be certain groups who wish to have power, and so they create kind of a system that will enforce that power, reinforce that power. And then there's, like, group dynamics, really, and, like, no one has. It's also at bottom. There's no real truth. There's no real
no
anything.
Objective reality.
Exactly.
No objective morality.
There's just the
moral relativism and all that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's just the standards that, like, are put forth by each group as, like, this is the right thing, and then if you follow it, you will end up powerful.
Yeah.
Basically.
So the way he connects this to Marxism, it seems to me, is. So in Marx's class analysis, it's a way of analyzing history through the lens of the competing interests of those in power versus the mass of people. And saying that, there's a conflict going on there because those in power are constantly trying to enact policies or various things to keep themselves in power and keep the masses out of power. Mm-hmm. So that's Marx's class analysis, essentially. And what Peterson is saying is that after Marxism essentially became not okay in the 60s and all of that,
proved to be wrong in that's like his thing is like,
right, which is something I want to also critique because he's not taking into account the mass political war that was waged on left-wing thinkers. It's not like it was a logical debate and everyone agreed that it wasn't okay. It was a purging of that whole political identity and discussion.
Totally.
I agree that that's not a fair assessment. You can't really say that it was proved that it won't work.
Well, and I think, okay, so with this whole thing that, like, even that postmodernism kind of, like, take that I just said is kind of like a stereotype. It's not really, because postmodernism is obviously, it's a critique of the intellectual structures that we've created. Right. So, in that way, it's really easy to say that they don't like any kind of intellectual structures, but if you look at the postmodernist philosophers, like, and you read them, they obviously believed in using some kind of structure to get out that information that maybe structures should be, like, contemplated. But I would say that in that same kind of idea is, like, Jordan stereotypes Marxism as what took place during communist Russia.
Exactly. He only points to kind of like that state control of things and calls that Marxism. Well, and he does go into the psychology of, like, of power relations and all that too.
Well, and he almost, I don't know, like, I would like to look into that. I don't know about it as much as you do. I don't know about the economic system as well as you do for communism. But the idea that he once puts forth is that these were necessary transitions because it didn't happen just in Russia. It also happened in China. And it was like that for some reason when people decide to go communism, it ends up killing millions and millions and millions of people because they do it maybe in an inefficient way. But he's like, well, is that implicit in trying to change over to that system?
This is my big problem with him, is he seems to say that any alternative to capitalism equals authoritarian government control. And that Marx inherently means that. Marxism means that. Everything I was listening to seemed for him to be painting.
I don't know if he ever says anything about, like, capitalism being the best thing, but I do definitely think he's said that communism is not a good alternative.
Yeah.
He definitely thinks that it's the worst.
For sure.
Yeah, no, definitely. I want to find the note. There was definitely one point where he said that. Oh yeah, here he goes. He says, "Society is flawed, but we have no better alternative to what we have." So that's what literally he said that.
Totally.
That there is no viable alternative to capitalism.
At least that
because we've tried them and they didn't work.
Yeah.
So he really is kind of equating the critique of capitalism to the experimentation of state-run society and saying that didn't work.
I think we got to be careful about that one because I would want to know what he was saying around that, also in the context of that, because I feel it seems silly to me that he would say there's no alternative to what we have now.
Well, there was,
and I'm sure he'd probably dig further into that.
Yeah.
That was his quote, but I mean,
well,
obviously, if you said, "Well, let's talk about hypothetical things we haven't tried yet,"
yes,
then maybe
he's not saying that we should stay where we are and not change anything.
That's why I would
I would assume from that statement.
Well, he went on to talk about how all we have is how do we reform what we have?
Yeah.
We shouldn't be trying to get something new.
Right.
So that is again where I would disagree with him.
Yeah, I mean, well, that is that one's difficult. He's also very Jungian, so the other
which
thing
I like
is,
about him because
yeah,
like
well,
Jung.
one of the things that Carl Jung said though is that you shouldn't try to take on other cultures. You should try to develop your own culture from where it is, because if you try to take on another culture, you basically he had the idea of there being even this evolution aspect to it, where you're literally it would be like us trying to breathe CO2. It's like you don't have the equipment.
Right.
So I don't know if I would agree with that, especially with the kind of neuroscience that we've had about how the brain can adapt to different situations. But I would say that maybe it's good to think about it in the way where it's structurally all of the structures that we've created in the West and how our government is set up and stuff like that. Maybe it's really it is more important than to try to flip all of that you try to adapt it to become better.
That's what I would say too, because I think it's fundamentally more likely that you would go down that path than have a switch.
And then you have to get into are you talking about flipping everything or just a core mechanism?
Well, that's why
I'm talking about.
That's why I really think I would love to see that Richard Wolff thing, because I think because of how much we what we've talked about is of it being compatible with capitalism is I think that would be the number one thing where it would be I don't
compatible with markets or
markets, I guess. Sorry.
Well, we do have to talk about those definitions.
Yes.
Yeah.
And here's something that I would say about what Jordan Peterson believes, and I'm sort of painting between the lines here a little bit, but my understanding is that he does not. So he really hates quality of outcome, right? And I think he really doesn't like state-run economy,
right?
And so I agree with him on those points.
Me too.
And I would say the biggest critique of any completely Marxist idea of totally equality of outcome, which maybe that's not exactly what Marx is advocating for, but that's the idea of communism, right? Is that it removes incentive structures.
Definitely.
And so Jordan Peterson is essentially saying we need incentive structures or nothing's going to work.
And if you're going to say that the idea of equality of outcome, we should just essentially understand that that's not okay. Mm-hmm. I agree with that completely.
Yes, I think we should say that. I think we should have a floor below which no one is allowed to fall in terms of their outcome. But after that, I think we cannot have equality of outcome where people won't try to do anything.
See, and this gets into an interesting thing where he's critiquing the feminist movement, because he talks about how the feminist movement is a neo-Marxist movement because it takes the template of Marxian class analysis, where you observe those with the concentration of power and those without. And he says the modern feminist movement does the same thing, but it just paints the patriarchy as the oppressor and women as the oppressed. And in his mind, it means that it's kind of this is my interpretation of him, so obviously I could be wrong. But he paints it as it's kind of like a fundamentalist thing, where you turn all men into the enemy. And it's about, overcoming the enemy at any cost and that kind of thing. And he equates that to its connection with Marxism. But, I mean, in a lot of ways, I think the irony of that is that kind of developed after the crushing of real Marxist and left-wing thought. And this whole development of identity politics and this current idea that a lot of left-wing movements have, which isn't about overturning the hierarchical structure, but simply integrating oppressed groups into it. So you have this idea now where it's like, oh, capitalism's fine, we just need women and black people on the boards of directors. And that will fix the problem.
Right.
I really think that has been something that the left has been steered into by the political establishment to steer them away from critiquing class and wealth and concentrations of power. And you see the Democratic Party co-opting all of these things. They have no problem with it.
Totally.
They've gotten fully on board with this idea. We need more women. We need women in Congress. We need women in the boards of directors. All these things. I don't think that in any way deals with the core problem, and neither would Marx, because Marx talked about that hierarchy being the problem. So even though it has that oppressor template, it is fundamentally un-Marxist because it does not deal with the hierarchy itself.
So what I would say is the part that he's taking from Marxism is the equality of outcome again. And so the fact that feminists, for instance, what we were talking about before we started the podcast with the transgender man who became a woman competing in MMA fighting women.
Right.
Like that idea that they're fundamentally equal, that women and men are fundamentally equal, that I would say is what he's critiquing in the feminist movement. They want equality of outcome for women, when in reality there's a lot of psychological and biological reasons that they're not equally represented in various fields. Yeah. So like Google, for instance, this brings up the whole idea of that letter that the Google employee wrote. Did you hear about that?
I did hear about that.
He's also in the intellectual dark web.
Oh, cool. Yeah. So that guy was a Google employee, and they asked everybody what they could do better to facilitate women in the workplace and get more women to come work with them. And he wrote them a letter about it, saying like these are things that would help. And he was very honest about it and very realistic about it, and in no way sexist from my perspective.
Well, what are some of his arguments?
He said that women are more social than men, and they prefer to interact with people more, so maybe more group work would be a better way.
People-oriented as opposed to technical-oriented.
Yes, which is psychologically supported. And I'm trying to remember the other ones. It was that kind of vein, though, where he was talking about these are things that we know from psychology and biology that are different in women.
See, and there is this this interesting problem with the idea of if anyone tries to say there's inherent differences between different groups like men or women, people freak out.
Yeah.
And I think that caution is certainly warranted. I mean, all you have to do is look at our history of saying justifying our treatment of black slaves for various social Darwinistic reasons.
Right.
But I do think that's certainly you can't ignore the fact that biologically there's certain predispositions.
Well,
especially between men and women.
It's the thing is like I think one of the biggest critiques that Jordan Peterson has is he's a personality psychologist, so he's done a lot of research on the differences between men and women, and also just different traits, and he goes into the idea that if you look at how the distribution of, he usually goes into aggression of women and men, there's a lot of overlap. Yeah. But if you go to the tips of who are the most aggressive people, it will always be men, and that's why there's so many men in prison. And so then he's like, okay, so
it's not the only reason there's so many men in prison. There's a huge problem there also.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, it's obviously more complicated than that. Well, that's different.
And all kinds of things.
It's still men, though. But the idea is that he was like, okay, well, that seems to be a pretty legit reason as to why there would be at least a greater number of men in prisons.
Definitely.
So it's like, okay, so if we take that for granted, then we just say, okay, if you want to take your idea of equality of outcome, and then you just change that to should there be just as many females in prison now? And literally he says, he's talked to women who are advocating for this, who do advocate for that.
Yeah, see, that's silly to me.
Yeah, exactly.
Just my own personal point of view, I think that's silly.
But the big thing that I think is important when it comes to listening to Jordan Peterson about what he's saying is it's not like he's making this up. People actually have that narrative, and he's like, that narrative is bad.
Definitely.
And it is, I do think that it is difficult because it does come to that whole he has this I wouldn't, instead of stereotypical, I would say like a pragmatic view of both postmodernism and Marxism, where he says, well, how are people using it right now? And then he'll just use the word Marxism, and it's like, okay, or neo-Marxism, and he'll say, but it's actually how people are using it.
But he will talk, like, I watched a lot of his stuff on Marxism, and he turns it into like this general thing, like, this is what Marxism is.
Right.
And he makes a lot of generalizations that obviously I have problems with.
I do think that what Drew just said is accurate, though. He's using it in the way that it's manifested, not the way that it was theorized.
Also, and I think that...
Well, also, but he's not... it is manifesting in other ways, too. It's just not so loud and in your face, and so he's taking that one to task.
I would say, like, the thing that I'm, like, definitely seeing, too, is that you don't like how he's using it because you're worried about people... Because he obviously defines it. He's like... If you like what you just said was he generalizes it, and then he'll define those generalizations. So the idea is that you're kind of worried about the same thing that happened during like the Cold War, which is socialism's bad, and then everyone starts thinking that rather than actually looking into what's occurring.
The ideas itself.
Well,
Exactly. Too much terminology.
Trump just did that at his rally, like with the whole like cricket Hillary, but he said like. Trying to get people excited to vote and being like the Democrats just want social policies, they want to take your guns away, like all these things without actually defending any of the arguments or understanding that like we have a socialist, like we already have social policies within our capitalist society. We're not 100% capitalistic.
For sure.
Well, he says all kinds of weird shit. Like he'll say that like, you know, with Medicare for all, they want to take your Medicaid. Like it's Medicaid, it's Medicare for all. Like, are you saying you're going to lose supplementary health programs we currently have in place in exchange for a universal, all-encompassing one? Oh, bummer. Like, oh no. Like,
well, I guess,
they're going to take your Obamacare. Like, not that he'd say that.
Yeah, there's
the same idea where it's like you're getting more. Like, what do you...
Yeah, there's something that I wanted to say about the, just the equality of outcome type thing. Jordan Peterson makes a really good argument for why men are overrepresented in the highest paying jobs and, you know, like the top of the hierarchies. And what he says is that conscientiousness and just like an obsession with your work is way more common in men than it is with women. Right. So you have women that come out of law school, for instance, and they're fucking amazing lawyers. Like they're working just as much as men, which is like 70, 80 hours a week to be at the top of that field. And they're working just as much as that, and they're moving up in the companies and they become partners and whatever else. But then there comes a certain point in their life where they realize this is silly. Like I'm wasting my life. Yeah. I'm not getting what I want out of it. And oftentimes they leave or they, you know, go to a job that doesn't require as much of their life. Whereas you have these men that are obsessed with that and they use it as like this way to win the social dominance hierarchy. Yeah. And you can look at it from an evolutionary perspective. You know, men have a huge incentive to reach the top of some sort of hierarchy because it increases their ability to breed, right? Whereas women can choose. They may above and across on the dominance hierarchy. So they don't necessarily have to be as high on the dominance hierarchy to get a mate that's equal or better than them on that scale.
See, and this is an interesting topic because then we have to explore, you know, how many of these characteristics are, if not entirely byproducts, partially byproducts of the societal constructs we have in place.
That's interesting.
And I think that this is one of Peterson's critiques of postmodernism, is a postmodernist would say it's entirely constructs causing it.
Yeah.
And then Jordan tends to lean the other way and say, no, it's not constructs, there's innate things here. I think it's definitely a lot of both, and I think that requires a lot of parsing through, you know, how many of these things are results of the institutions and the culture and the constructs we have in place.
Yes. Are
those things tilting it in favor of one group or another? There's things there, and I think that critique is valid. But I definitely think if you're going to say, no, it's all constructs, none of that's real, it's all an oppressive institutional construct, I think that's an extreme statement and not good.
Yeah, so I agree. I think a lot of people tend towards that view. Right. And I think that's kind of why Jordan Peterson hammers that point so much.
For sure. And then, so another point he make is he talked about how... Wait, what's up?
It's just Will's phone was going off.
Oh, okay. So another point he makes is he critiques the idea that society has been historically patriarchal. And the reason he says this, what he said was that, well, if you look actually in history, during all these times, men were suffering horribly as well. You know, he pointed to feudalism and said, you know, men were working in horrible conditions and barely scraping by and all this stuff. I think, again, he's overgeneralizing to try and critique feminism and the problems he sees in feminism, because while that's very much true, that, you know, white men, whether it's in American history or European history, have suffered greatly under, you know, capitalism or feudalism, there has also been an intentional hierarchy put into place to keep the mass of people pitted against each other. So, yes, it was patriarchal in the sense that women had a lot of times a lower rung on the hierarchy than the men did, even though the men were still in horrible conditions. I mean, you see this very clearly in American labor history, where the main mechanism used was race, where they would, you know, select races to be in lower levels of the hierarchy to keep, you know, the white men going, okay, well, at least I'm not there. And to keep them satisfied that they have a little bit more, and to keep them pitted against each other to keep that structure in place. I mean, there's a lot of examples in our labor history of them literally bringing in, like if labor was organizing too much. There was one example in Hawaii where the Japanese labor force was organizing too much. And so the capitalists there asked the government to bring in a bunch of, I think it was people from the Philippines or Indonesia, something like that. Anyway, to bring them in to pay them way less, so to put them in competition with each other.
Yep.
Obviously, with black people, it's been used the most. That was like a huge part going into the Civil War, was like wage laborers not wanting the spread of slavery because it was competition for their ability to find jobs.
Right.
And then once blacks were allowed in the workforce, it was used still as like a competition hierarchy to reinforce those levels.
Definitely.
So, I mean, that's like one of the really interesting things for that too is like, I just watched the Eric Weinstein and Ruben talking about how one of Eric's things, like his wife, Eric Weinstein's wife, did a whole dissertation, because she was also, I think she's actually in economics. And one of the big things was like, they literally had they had a bunch of the government's program for scientists were trying to get a bunch of immigrant scientists to come over so that they could make it so that scientists weren't even getting paid as much as they should be, because they were doing so much development.
Right.
They were trying to keep their payment, like their wages low.
Right.
So even that too, it's like I think there are obvious like shows of that reinforcement of power structure and it not evolving. That's like what I think, like one of the big things is like, you obviously want the idea that Jordan Peterson gets across is that you need a power structure so that people can have movement. And it's that really classic idea that it's the same thing with like equality of outcome. You need to have something. If everyone's not equal at the end, there's obviously something that is making it so that they can differentiate.
Right.
So you need to be able to define that, but that definition needs to be adaptable. So
But I agree with you, but I also have problem with the way he presents it with that, what's it called, principle.
The
anyway,
Pareto oh my god.
But yeah, he seemed to be arguing in my mind that inequality is inescapable inherently, whereas I think it's primarily a result of that hierarchical structure. So, I mean, say if we had, democratic workplaces, putting in, rules that, like Mondragon does. So saying, the person at the top can't make more than 8 times the lowest.
Right.
So it's way more self-contained.
Totally, yeah.
So, I mean, you can't eliminate inequality of outcome.
Right.
100%. But the gross inequality in the capitalist system is a problem. Yeah. And it can be dealt with.
Totally, and
he seems to steer away from that critique.
Well, I don't even know if I've heard any, that's why, again, I would be really interested in seeing this debate between him and Richard Wolff, because I don't know if anyone's ever, even budged on the idea that everyone should have more of an equality of outcome idea, where it's the idea is, this is, the actual, scientific, results of the Pareto distribution. It's actually that there are a small amount of people who do most of the work. Right. So it's and it's not, I think it might be a 2080 thing,
but it was showing in any particular field, And he talked about this where it's like, so one way to deal with that is to have a diversification of fields because different people are just going to excel at different things.
Yeah.
And that's just human diversity for you. It's,
Totally.
you know, why we did well in the wild as a tribe with different people with different skill sets.
Well, and it's why you want to also reward those people who do obviously give back to the society more than others. Like that is, you know, that's what they're doing by doing that. So you have to be able to reward them in an appropriate way. And I think that's the thing that is like such a problem here is that the people who are doing a lot, they do deserve more. Yeah. Like, cool, like you created computers. But awesome.
You shouldn't make them like lords over society.
No,
yeah, that's
over the
all.
earth.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
That's, you know.
It is like 80-20, by the way.
It is 80-20?
Yeah, for most things. Although it does change for a given system. So...
I think that's why we need to get money out of politics so that it has less of an effect on when you have billions of dollars, you can literally buy puppets.
I know, right?
To play your game to push your agenda.
Certainly a huge problem.
Yeah, so, I mean...
Is that all you had on Jordan Peterson?
I mean, there's a little bit more. I want to wait till Drew gets back. But just kind of reiterating one of my points from earlier is I definitely think this idea on the left of we just need equal societal representation at the top of these hierarchical structures is a silly idea. I don't think it is fundamentally Marxist at all. Even so, that's where it's like the neo-Marxist, the idea of like it's about the oppressed and the oppressor, but it's not about overturning the hierarchy, which is the whole point of Marx.
Right. Yeah, I think definitely equality of outcome is just a nasty
idea.
Sure. I think it's a good point where we can all agree, and that's nice. As far as the way Jordan Peterson is representing some of these things, I agree with you that he could be a little more careful and maybe define what he's talking about more and try to diverge from the terms that he's using.
Yeah.
Because I don't think he's thinking of Marxism in the way that you are. And I think he's picking the points that have been used for certain cases and saying these are bad.
Yeah.
And I agree with him in that regard.
So another point, this isn't quite related, but it just kind of gets to the fundamental difference of perspective I'm always going to have with Jordan Peterson. It really gets to the base ideology. Is he did a little video talking about Rousseau. And so Rousseau is like one of the foundational ideological points in the Enlightenment, if you're going to talk about the current ideologies in the world right now. So one of the points Rousseau makes is the idea of the noble savage. The idea that man is inherently egalitarian and overall morally good in its natural state in nature. And his idea was that, so the most extreme immoralities of man are largely products of civilization itself. And so the idea that Rousseau posited with the social contract is to say that society must, all things considered, improve upon the state of nature. And so that idea is whatever man's lot was in the wilderness as hunter-gatherers, society must net benefit the individual in terms of how free they are, what's available to them, the overall state of their life. And Jordan Peterson criticized this, the whole idea that, so he posited that man is not inherently good. And he compared us to, he talked about like how vicious chimps are, and saying that's the state of nature. You know, man is inherently vicious, and it is civilization which makes us better. And this is something I fundamentally disagree with. And, you know, I think this is a big part of the left-right divide. So, like, Chomsky also comes down strongly on the side of Rousseau in this discussion. And I think our work in anthropology backs this up. The idea that, you know, there's still, you know, bad things that occurred in hunter-gatherer societies. There's killing, there's rape, there's these things. But
genocide.
I think, but I think all in all, things are far worse right now. And that, you know, we've lost a lot of the most important things that we had as hunter-gatherers in our natural state that we need to rediscover. And, anyway. I mean, what do you think about that, Drew? Or Dwight?
Go ahead, Drew. I got a lot to say about that.
Yeah, I don't agree with that. I think that's a really good
with what
narrative with Rousseau. I think that's a really good narrative to shoot for. But the one thing that I'm worried about is that falls into like this kind of like mythology that there were like the good old days where we were great, and then
Right,
we're
and
gonna
you do
get
got to
back
be careful
to
there.
those.
You can't overly idealize.
It's also
our ancient
really
past.
easy to pick and choose your tribe, right?
True.
You can look through all the tribes
True.
that ever were, and you can be like, hey, look at that one. That had a great idea where this was egalitarian and everybody seemed happy. But there's shit tons of tribes
That's
where
true.
people were not happy. They were essentially
Some very
murdering
brutal
people over and over.
Yeah.
I mean, there's tons of examples of that. And I would say as a whole, society has gotten much better than that in lots of ways. For instance, we're way safer than we ever were. People are way...
Well, I mean, in the Western world specifically.
Yes.
I honestly think if you take the entire human population into account, that might not be true. But I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
That's not true either.
What
Like that, yeah.
What you read?
Well, that's actually one of the things that Jordan Peterson has brought up later. I'm not sure in the videos that you've checked out, but it's like one of the things he has been called out on that before. Ben.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and the thing is, like overall in the world, there's way less infant mortality than there used to be.
Mm.
There's a lot
Right.
there, and this is totally not to say that we could be doing so much better. That is totally true.
Well,
but
then
the
there's
idea
also
is
this
that
whole
we're
thing of quantity versus quality. Is it's like,
Yes.
sure, we're living longer,
right.
all these different things, but is the quality of life of the average person in the modern age
Yeah.
better
Well,
than
they say-
living in hunter-gatherer
They say our work week
No,
is
oh, yeah.
longer today
Yes.
than it used to
Yeah,
be.
you
in
used
the
to only have to work 30
hunter-gatherer.
hours a week
So
as a
that's-
So
hunter-gatherer.
your
Yeah,
quality of
right.
And
life
anthropologists
might be-
point to their higher, happiness levels, which we talked about in earlier podcasts.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot to be said about tribes of old. I think they did have a lot of things going for them. But I would say overall, the idea that we have moved backwards is just fundamentally
Well, see,
wrong.
I'm not trying to make that position.
Okay.
There's a lot of ways where we move forward,
Mhm.
but I do think we have abandoned things that were very positive that we need to get back.
Yeah,
There
I
are
can
certain
totally agree with
aspects
that.
of
I can
modern
totally agree
civilized
with
society that
Yes.
I think is worse than quality of life was as hunter-gatherers.
And I would
That's all.
agree with that. for
My
sure.
biggest thing about Rousseau saying that we're fundamentally good, and what was the other posit?
So,
Fundamentally good and egalitarian, right? So I think the
all
biggest
in all. So
issues.
he was clear in his writing that it was like not
Yeah.
100%. But
Yeah, because there's lots of tribes that obviously weren't.
yeah,
at all.
if you looked at
Maybe like the
and
normal.
we should be clear that he was
Average.
positing this entirely from his research of the Native Americans.
Right.
So
Mm.
this was during the time when America was cleansing the Native Americans,
Totally okay.
and it was during the rise of the Romantic period in Europe,
Mm.
and a lot of information about the Native tribes written by researchers was coming over,
Mhm.
and so there was this emergence within the Romantic movement of going, oh my God, look at all these things we've lost.
Sure.
We've gained all these things, but look at the squalor in industrial Europe. Look at the war. Look at all of this stuff.
Yeah.
And you compare it to the life of a Native American,
Right.
and you go, okay, some things are better, but we've lost some shit.
Yeah. For
We
sure.
need to relook at where we've come from.
Yeah.
And to say that, the nature of man in a hunter-gatherer setting is a more noble one than man in civilization, I personally do believe there's some real truth to that.
Yeah, I guess it depends on what you mean by noble, and
True.
I would definitely say there's a lot to argue about that because nobility, to me, it's obviously that's a difficult concept to even define.
Yeah, that's real.
But to say that one state of living is more noble than another is a really hard thing to do. To say that,
And this is
that
my own
running
ideological baseline, because
Yeah.
I always am going to favor more egalitarian
Sure.
forms of society, closer to nature, more equality within the group,
Yeah.
less
For instance,
hierarchical.
is it more noble to run around in the woods for 40 years and just hunt and gather and live your life free of essentially any otherworldly stress, or is it more noble to live your life as a researcher forever and end up saving tens of thousands of lives because you made a new vaccine?
Right.
So
So
there's
it's hard
lots of
because I
noble
think-
things that people
Yes.
do within our society now
Yes.
that I would say are completely impossible under the ideas of.
But I think
Native
part of this
American
argument is you can't. Society produces a lot of extremes. So it's like
For
if
sure.
you're going to compare hunter-gatherer society, which is much simpler,
Yes.
to civilization, you can't include the person who saves 1 million lives without saying the person who commits a mass genocide, because both those things are qualities of civilization.
But isn't that evening out then?
I think
Isn't
it
it,
does.
isn't it just
I guess
changing?
so, but I guess a lot of my context comes from where the world's going right now, which
Mhm.
I tend to have a more negative view of it, especially with climate change and all these different things coming
Yes,
down the road.
that's a good point.
So you can't have this discussion without that kind of like, where's it going?
Mhm.
The only way you
I
could
agree.
compare that argument, I guess, would be post-humanity.
Well,
You
that's
go,
why.
Did it pan out?
Yeah.
That's why I think it is important though not to like idolize either the future
Yes.
or the past, and
Yes.
just be like, what can we do better now?
Yes,
I agree.
and I think that's what
more
this
productive,
is.
for sure.
Definitely. And I really do think that that's what that argument is hearkening to, is to say civilization, in a lot of ways, has worsened us from our hunter-gatherer state. We should try to reclaim those things, reintegrate them into society, bring in the lessons we've lost.
Yeah,
That's
I totally
kind of my
agree with
point
that.
of view.
For sure.
Do you believe that humanity is inherently good?
I don't. I certainly.
It's a
So
tough one.
anyone who wants to know the way I think, I'm a very moralistic person.
Mhm.
All you guys know that. I think almost, definitely mostly in terms of morality. And I think humanity, especially in its natural state, which I tend to think of as the best representation of humanity, is more good than bad. So I do.
I guess we have to define good, but I mean, I see.
Well, there's a whole goddamn.
Right?
I don't
Yeah.
see as much different than like any other animal in nature, and for like a lion
I
to
think
kill
we're more. I
I
saw
mean, we have
superiority.
morals. We have the intellectual capability.
Well, there's more
to...
empathy. There's more caring about each other, interrelations. I mean, this is
Sometimes.
why. True,
Sometimes
but
there's a lot more suffering. You
it's
know?
true. But I think if the base, the standard hunter-gatherer society.
I
has
feel
that
like
kind
you
of
have a
thing.
very, very skewed idea of the standard hunter-gatherer society.
Well, maybe so, but I'm basing most of my views. I mean, I do idealize it some. So
Yes.
let me be clear with that.
Yeah.
But I also, this is most of what anthropology is teaching right now, is that the base human hunter-gatherer society, based off their research, was mostly egalitarian.
Yes.
More
Within their
less
tribe,
hierarchical.
and
That's
then when
the
they
thing,
met
we're
somebody from
trying
another
certainly.
tribe, they might tie them to a post and cut little bits of flesh off for
Right.
hours, and waiting for
There
them
was
to
certainly
scream,
brutality.
and then they would
Well,
kill
that's
them if
that's
they
the
screamed.
problem. So within our small groups, hunter-gatherer groups, we had that family. We
Right.
had
Yes.
we treat each other
But
with
they did-
respect and love.
Yeah.
But if you're outside of that group, we're gonna torture you. We're gonna kill you. We're gonna do whatever we
Rape
want.
your family.
But they did also, from what I've read from anthropology, they talked about how most conflicts that occurred between hunter-gatherer tribes was generally a direct tit for tat, as opposed to like ideological or like constant. There were cases of that where tribes had this long history of hating each other. But for the most part, it was generally like, well, this tribe took our horses because they needed horses. Okay, well now we're going to raid them because they did that. And it was much more less brutal than current human conflict, for sure. I'm not trying to whitewash it.
I would say the only thing that makes it less brutal is the scale. That's what I would say.
I
think in many
so.
ways it was way more brutal.
I don't know. I don't know if we've. I think we do plenty of horribly more brutal stuff now. I guess you could argue that's just a matter of our power and knowledge of how to be brutal. But
Well, it's also the disassociation that we're allowed now. When we have
Right.
drones that literally just can go blow up a building, we didn't see anyone die.
I
We
would
just
feel
know
confident
that they
in
died.
saying that the average hunter-gatherer was more moral towards other human beings than if you looked at society as a whole now.
They definitely had a certain gravitas with their actions, right?
Yeah.
Because if you killed someone, you did it right there, or if you helped someone, you did it right there.
But it's hard too, because you also, in society now, you have the mass of people, especially in America, who just kind of go about their day, and then you have the mass slaughter of our drone program, and it's like, is that an extension of us? Is that So it's like
Everything's
the actions of our states are far more violent than things used to be. Yet the actions of the individuals within that state might be far less.
That's
So it's
actually
really
not
difficult.
true either. There's
How
been
so?
less people dying due to wars than there was in percentage-wise. There's less violent crime that occurs now than there did even 40 years ago.
Oh, well, yeah, that's all in the context of civilization.
But wouldn't you agree that is but isn't that... Alright, so we're talking between groups?
So are you saying civilization is less violent now than it used to be?
Well, I'm
I
also
agree with
trying
that.
to understand what it is that you're necessarily speaking about. Are you talking about how people, how individuals treated other groups, or are you saying how they treated people within their groups?
I think he's comparing hunter-gatherer versus civilization.
Right, and but you guys have brought up the idea that if they capture someone, they might torture him or whatever.
Right.
That's a between group in
Right.
conflict versus an in-group conflict.
Right. And also the numbers for like killings with drones are relatively small. I mean, over the course of multiple years, we're looking at several hundred,
However,
maybe 1,000, which is not something that would be unreasonable for several Native American tribes to commit in a matter of the same amount of time.
Yeah, one of the biggest problems with our drone program is how much of it is civilians. I mean, it's like upwards of 90%.
The same thing happened with hunter-gatherers, though. You'd have one guy go and steal 40 horses, and then their entire tribe gets decimated. Because
although that was
that's
less often than like actual clashes between warrior groups.
Sure.
The most common form of tribal clash was groups of warriors.
right. And then if they lost, they would go in and rape all the women and kill them a lot of the time.
Well, I don't.
So
that was
that's civilians
that was
right
more
there.
rare.
Dead.
Yes, yeah, for sure.
It depends. I mean, I think it's really important that we don't try to overgeneralize what it was to be in hunter-gatherer. We need to know a history time frame. We need to know what, it's like, I think we're being a little bit too overgeneralized here. But
I think that's really fair. I guess my main point is to say that I agree with the premise that we've lost really central good things about humanity from our hunter-gatherer times that we need to reintegrate into society.
I would want to amend that there are certain tribes that had really awesome principles that we could take from. That's what I
agree, but I also mean just the general characteristics of hunter-gatherer groups.
Like the Mongols?
The Mongols were a nomadic warrior group.
Yes, but they were hunter-gatherers still. That's what they did. That's how they survived. And then they became warriors and they organized, right? So, I mean, there's lots of different...
That's like more of the... So when you look at the development of society, hunter-gatherer evolves into like chiefdoms.
Sure.
And that's a different thing. And I think Mongols would be under chiefdoms. Okay. Which is usually like a war-based, more hierarchical than a hunter-gatherer group. Because it's about raiding, specifically. Yeah. That's their primary mode of gathering.
Well, it's also
whereas a hunter-gatherer group, raids are more of a side thing.
Yeah, it's very common, however, when a hunter-gatherer runs out of resources that they're going to just go.
But again, that's like because of a necessity, not their baseline.
Also, civilization is definitely not a linear thing.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say that our baseline is going and killing a bunch of people. Yeah. We have maybe contrived ideas of why we do it, and there's a lot to be said about the reasons that we decide to kill other people, but it's not as if we just have this baseline of murdering people.
Yeah. Dude, I don't know. The only reason why I'm saying I don't know right now is because, like, what are we doing? Like,
are you specifically I guess
about America? Yeah, I'm talking about America. It's like, what are we doing? We do have some wars going on, right? It's
true.
I mean,
maybe
like
we're not 17 of them or something.
Yeah. And we're not doing our infrastructure.
I think it's 7 actually. Just to clarify.
Totally. And we're not working on our infrastructure. We're not. It's kind of like what are we doing?
Well, this gets back to empire again.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the things that I would agree with about, I guess what we're missing that maybe hunter gatherers had, even chiefdoms, even I guess if you just go back into history a little while, it's like we don't have a lot of like face-to-face contact with each other. Our social gatherings are more on the internet than in real life. Like, we don't really know. We don't have the experiential evidence of what's going on, what we're doing, why we're doing it. It's all in this kind of like meta Platonic kind of view, where it's like even our economic system, we're supposed to, and like again, it's very mythological, but it's like we're supposed to have this idea that capitalism gives better growth. And so even us having a capitalistic system or a democratic system, those are just good things. Like, by us having them, we're good people just by contributing to them. Like, both.
Even though you don't analyze what is being grown for what purposes,
dude. Well,
what's the cost?
The bummer part is you don't even necessarily experience that. I can't it's not like if you walked up to someone and says like, "Do you think that you're a better person because you contribute to democracy?" They would have to sit there and think about it. It's not like it's not like you fed someone food that was they were starving and you gave them a piece of bread. That's like, I helped diminish that person's suffering. That is very nice.
It's very abstracted.
Exactly. Exactly.
Real quick, one of the main arguments that Rousseau draws from the idea of the social contract, which putting aside kind of like the nuance of hunter-gatherer versus civilization, the idea that society should be an improvement upon the state of nature overall, otherwise what's the point? We should just go back to living in the woods.
Sure.
I agree with that. And so, drawing from that, Rousseau says, any social arrangement that constrains the free internal creative capacity of the individual is inherently invalid unless it can justify itself being for that greater good. And I completely agree with that.
I would be okay with that.
And that's the idea of like anything that infringes on the individual is part of that social contract.
Sure.
And if it's not improving upon the state of nature, so it's net good from that original state, then it is inherently oppressive or invalidating.
Not quite, because it's also saying that you would have to have a justification for it. So you can definitely diminish someone's rights as long as it's benefiting everyone as a whole.
Right.
Like that's you diminish your right to murder somebody because it's bad for society.
Exactly.
But
or we put a tax on carbon because it's important to continue the world. But you get to do your
one other thing I wanted to say about that, but we should really move on because we haven't even hit Sam Harris.
Let's do something where I'm going to talk less because I apologize for my prominence.
I wanted to say though, I think it's for the purposes of looking at what we can glean from those, quote unquote natural societies. I think this you could say you make a case that this is a natural society as well. But
true, and I don't mean natural.
Saying that
the original.
Well, that's kind of like it's kind of an interesting thing you have to define because natural state. Well, you could say this is our natural state because what other state is there, right? But saying being a hunter gatherer was better, quote unquote. I think it's important. We can look at some of the best tribes that we have knowledge of and try to take their values. But when you're comparing that to what we have now, I think it's only fair that you compare it to the best societies that we have now. You can't just compare it to.
I agree that you have to compare it to both, just like the overall state of civilization as a whole. And where it's going.
Yes. Well, I guess my point is that to say that, people are less happy, people are more constrained, work longer hours, saying all that, you're comparing their best society to one of ours. And that's like us now in the U.S., whereas
I would just
compare
that to average to the average.
Well, then I think we win 100%. That's
what I would say. I don't, so that'd be worth exploring more.
We should look into it more.
And I
feel
there's
shit tons of tribes.
The other thing too is it is fine to compare, but this is where I do actually think abstraction helps because we say, do we think it's good to make it so that everyone has a good amount of resources that are available? Right. Is it good to have good drinking water that's readily available, food that's readily available, that stuff we can all just say and then we can look at our society now and be like, do we have those things? Yes or no?
Is it good to be close to nature? Is it good to have an egalitarian form of
it just seems more productive than the comparison, but comparisons also help us form what those are, so that's true.
But this is worth talking about in the sense that this is one of the roots of different ideological divides that comes from the Enlightenment. So I
think we should talk about it on another podcast.
For sure, we can actually get into Enlightenment ideology. That'd be awesome.
Do you guys have anything to say about that before we move on? Because I wanted to talk about Sam Harris.
No, we're good.
Right. Oh, I'm going to feature a lot in that one too. Okay.
Yes, you are.
I'm going to go to the bathroom real quick. So.
All right. Well, I guess we can't talk about it yet because Dan has to.
You can do your intros about him and stuff.
Yeah. Well, I want you to hear it too, though.
Okay.
Do you guys know anything about Sam Harris?
Yeah, he's one of the ones I listen to.
You listen to his podcast, or
yeah,
nice. Yeah, I like him a lot. I think he has a lot of really good ideas, and he thinks really clearly.
Do you know, do you want to are you going to give an intro about who he is?
Sure, I could do that.
You could probably do that now.
Yeah, so for those that don't know, Sam Harris is a neuroscientist, and how long did he study? So he went over to India, and he studied, is it India, or is it?
I think so.
Yeah, so he went over to one of the Buddhist countries, and he studied under Buddhist monks for, 3 years?
It was 3, yeah.
And so he's done a lot of meditation and a lot of looks at meditation, and now he more functions as sort of a philosopher. He just kind of he's written a couple books, and he talks a lot on his podcast with various people about philosophical topics and just sort of things in the political dialogue and his feelings on that. So he's more of like a political commentator and a philosopher at this point in his life. I don't really know how much he contributes to neuroscientific research, but I know that his stated interests lie much more in moral philosophy.
Yeah, when it like the main thing about he got a bachelor's in philosophy, which got him really interested in values, and then he became a neuroscientist because he wanted to use that technology to be able to do it. So his PhD was basically, and like him working in the lab, was trying to distinguish which brain areas actually functioned for values.
Nice.
So he would interview people and like try to figure out whether or not like certain brain regions would be more distinct during evaluations versus like mathematical like that. So that just gets into his really interesting research. So
that's cool.
Yeah, I would recommend definitely looking into that because he did do some really cool research in that.
Yeah, so I think one of his biggest talking points and one of the things that he's the most well known for is that he's a huge critic of religion, in particular Islam. Mostly dogmatic interpretations of those, but he is pretty anti-religion in general, and that's one of the biggest clashes that he and Jordan Peterson have, honestly, is that Jordan Peterson thinks that there's a huge amount of value in religion, whereas Sam Harris thinks that there's value in it insofar as it's a philosophical text and there's philosophy within it that can be useful, but he thinks that it's fundamentally weaker than other sources of that same philosophy and that you can find better representations of those philosophical ideas from other sources and that the sort of deifying of the text inherently makes it worse.
Right.
And I tend to agree with him on that. I think
me too.
I like that Jordan Peterson actually did like an in-depth look at Christianity from a psychological perspective, and he actually has those lectures online, which are pretty interesting. And I think there is definitely a lot to be gleaned from that, and it's very interesting from a historical and psychological perspective. But I would agree with Sam Harris that if you want to dive into philosophy, it's far better to do it, one, knowing that you're reading the thoughts of people and not some deity, right? Yeah. So to think that abstraction. Yeah, to think that a deity wrote these things is pretty silly.
It's not an abstraction, it's like the abstraction.
Right, the abstraction.
The one who makes
there is no abstraction other than this abstraction.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think Jordan Peterson's idea of God is very interesting, and the way that he talks about it is really interesting, but I think as far as trying to orient your moral values and to think of philosophical ideas, it's much better to do that with philosophers and what they've written. So anyway, that's sort of my view on his views of religion. And he's actually written a book with Majid Nawaz or something, I can't say his name, but about Islamic reform, because Islam is the one that he thinks is the worst, because the Quran is so difficult to interpret in a way that's not violent and inherently divisive, and he points to that as causing a lot of huge problems in a lot of Islamic communities, and I would tend to agree with him in that regard as well. So yeah, I would say overall I agree with him in a lot of ways on a lot of things, but there's certainly some political points that I don't agree with, and we'll get into some of those in that when we talk about gun control if we get there today.
We gotta get all this shit.
I know, we got a lot of shit.
Where are we at time wise?
It's 12:30 right now.
Started at 10:30.
You're the one with that thing.
I mean, the religion thing, I agree with Sam Harris almost completely, but he wants to restructure Islam versus, I think religion overall is just outdated.
Yes, I agree.
And I think I think naturally we're going to move on, but I think the sooner the better.
Yeah, I think his sort of argument, the way I understand it, for restructuring it is that the way that we've moved into a more secular society. There we go. The way that we moved into a more secular society in terms of Christianity was by sort of incremental reform in terms of, taking away, we don't really look at the Old Testament anymore.
Yeah.
And then it sort of evolved naturally. I think that he sees that as a fundamentally more likely route for reform.
Has Islam not done that?
Not
it's like
really
their
at all.
holy scriptures that they don't touch.
They haven't really reformed it as far as I know.
I mean, we're considered the most Christian nation on Earth. America is. So
that seems wrong, because I know that Orthodox Christianity is really big in Russia. Like they have the kind of thing with like killing gay people and all that sort of stuff.
I'm not saying that there aren't going to be more Christian, like more extreme Christian people in
What are you
Russia,
talking about?
but I mean actually like are the most politicians. We have the most politicians who say they
It's
are
like
Christian.
70 or 80%.
We just, I mean,
Yeah, the
Of course, they
population.
just say that. So
The
that they get
population
Exactly,
of
but-
like how many people believe in these things, I think, is the highest
Right.
here.
Interesting.
Russia is a much more authoritarian society, so maybe that manifests in a more extremist way.
Yeah.
But that's kind of one thing that I generally tend to have some problems with what Sam Harris talks about is it seems to me like he thinks all of the extremism arises from the ideas within the text itself, which I think there's a lot of truth to that. But I also think it has a huge amount to do with the material circumstances of the culture at that time. So, I mean, Islamic fundamentalism certainly has seen an enormous increase with the American wars in the region. I mean, terrorism has gone through the roof since we invaded. I don't know the exact numbers, but it's way higher than it was before we invaded Iraq. And so, there's also that when you destroy the secular institutions and you make people's material circumstances so desperate and so filled with despair, they're going to be much more susceptible to those extremist ideologies, especially as a source of revenge or because they're hopeless and they need something to do with themselves.
Definitely that. I'm not denying that happens.
One more point real quick is they did, they did I forget when, but the United States did a poll of people in the Middle East showing like what is the primary motivation for terrorism, and it came out as primarily political.
Yeah.
So that shows that at the very least that's a huge component, and it's not just about the ideas within the religion itself.
I can see that for sure, but the reason why I even brought up us being Christian, the reason why I brought it up was an example of this is like one of the most Christian nations, at least like if not the most, one of the most, but like Muslim nations are like decidedly they are Islamic. Like you have the hijab being necessary.
Yeah. They're more theocratic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's obviously.
But we should also note that has an so like Iran, for example, was far more secular until we overthrew their democratically elected government, put in an authoritarian Shah, and then in response to him cracking down on the population in a totalitarian way, there was an Islamic revolution because in that state of being oppressed, those Islamic extremists were much more. The people were much more susceptible to those messages because they were so angered by that. But I mean, they were turning into a Western culture. They were wearing American-style clothing, even the women. And then there was this theocratic revolution in response to us seizing their government. So, I mean, these things don't happen in a vacuum. That's an example of what I'm talking about. Not to say that's across the board.
Yeah. Well, one of the other things that I wanted to point out is that part of the reason that terrorism went up when we invaded is that we overthrew Saddam Hussein, and he was a pretty secular ruler, and he was holding down a lot of the religious extremism. And then after we killed him, it sparked a civil war between the Sunnis and the Shiites.
Well, we should also note part of that is part of our occupation tactics is we literally separated the different sects into different parts of the cities. We intentionally separated them. It was part of our war strategy. So, I mean, again, these things don't happen. There's meddling. That's a contributing factor.
So I think this is an important conversation, but I don't know, like, it is a very good critique of, like, how the U.S. has obviously done awful things in their foreign policy. But the thing that I would, if we're gonna, like, talk about Sam Harris, I think the one thing that he would probably say...
We shouldn't stray too far into side shit here. But
I think one of the things he would say about that is that if there wasn't the Muslim religion, of course he goes into his, like, crazy, like, just remove this, which is like not useful, not pragmatic. But it's like if it wasn't there, there wouldn't have been that easy material to be like, oh well, there's a holy war. It's like, oh well, if you go kill everyone, now you get to go to paradise.
But, I mean, one could almost say, at least from the point of view of the country dealing with that interference from an outside power, they might argue that that's a good thing. Maybe that's a defense mechanism against, outside invaders is like at times of, great stress, we become jihadists, and then
Totally, but that's...
I mean, Afghanistan's never been successfully, held indefinitely. Maybe that's a part of that.
Yeah, this is going
Not
to
that
get
I'm saying
really...
I'm justifying that at all.
Yeah.
I think it's
And
still
they're
overall
terrain.
way negative.
Well, it's going to get messy, too, because it's like, well, the reason that we went over there was because of some Muslim extremists crashing planes into some of our buildings.
See, but I disagree.
And
with that.
I
We
know,
invaded Iraq.
I know. It's hard because I don't know. See, and that's actually something with Sam, too, is that he is very much on the narrative, like, in that way. He's like,
This is one of the main critiques of him from the
things.
left, is he seems to parrot the establishment narrative about our foreign policy decisions. And so a lot of those critiques of him say, well, you're doing that because you've selected this group, the Islamic religion, as negative, and you're now being tribalistic. You're not when you justify American foreign policy, you're not looking at both sides equally because you're just attacking the outgroup in your mind.
Yeah, reinforcing.
Right.
Any of the biases that he already has.
Well, I also think that he has a good point when he does some of that, though, in that to just completely argue for pacifism in the face of terrorism seems silly.
I disagree with that.
So that
for sure.
seems to be a lot of the ultra left what they would argue. It's like, let's just leave them alone. It's not our problem. Like, we can't go and police them and control them and tell them what to think.
Right.
But then it's like, okay, well, you have entire nation states that support the clitorectomies and support stoning gay people.
And the irony is that the very worst offender in terms of a state in that regard is Saudi Arabia. That's where the most extreme sect of Islam comes from, and they're one of our closest allies for purely power reasons.
Sam Harris is a huge critic of that, though.
Which I applaud him for. That's very, very good.
I think this gets into like what I was talking about when we were talking about the comparisons between the hunter-gatherers versus the civilization. It's like, I think there's a hesitancy for like the left, who I think most of the time thinks of themselves as the more progressively moral, and they want to have more like moralistic thinking. It's like they'll be like, yeah, let's talk about, of course it's not okay to say no, that you can't have an abortion. Like, no, that's not, we can't have a law that says that here. And then they're like, yeah, because we like, that's morally not okay, right? And it's like, yeah, that's totally not morally okay. And then they're like, okay, but then we look at this nation, and they do this thing that's like way worse. They do genital mutilation, and they're like, "Oh well, that's their choice." And it's like, but we said it's not morally okay.
That's
so can't we just say that it's not okay for them to do it?
But this really does get into the whole conversation we had last time about imperialism and multinational government. Because like my personal belief is, I never agree with unilateral direct interference in other nations.
Real. Yeah, I would agree with that too.
I would say that kind of thing should be called out. It should be attacked diplomatically, economically.
Real.
And if anything is physically done, it should be part of a coalition of states.
Totally.
We invaded Iraq with the
only the British joined us. All like the UN voted. We violated the way the UN functions, and that the UN actually said no to it. And that was the first time the U.S. violated the UN framework for interference.
Because it was a national,
which was a huge blow to the legitimacy of the UN.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the beginning of like the blatant, era of American imperialism.
Sure. So what would you advocate for doing in the face of someone like Saddam Hussein, you can question whether or not we actually thought that he had WMDs, but...
Well, first of all, connecting that in any way to 9/11, I think, was atrocious.
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense.
So that was used as the justification for the invasion, A. We should note that the people who were the architects of the invasion, like Dick Cheney, they authored some paper. It was called, the New American Century. And it was after the Cold War. They were trying to say, okay, what's the next era of American power now that we're the sole hegemon? And they talked about how we would need a new Pearl Harbor as an excuse to project American power and cement American hegemony.
That's where you get all the conspiracy theories of 9/11.
See, I have no position about 9/11 being an inside job or anything like that. But clearly, it could be, it could not be.
Yeah.
But clearly, we use 9/11 to further our geopolitical aims that had nothing to do with the reasons we cited.
I would agree with that. I would also say, just on the point of 9/11 being a conspiracy, the idea that it was somehow they like snuck thermite into the buildings so that they could, like, the idea that steel doesn't melt at a high enough temperature or whatever. All you need, that's just a misunderstanding of the physics involved. All you need to do is heat something up and its yield strength goes down. And they've seen that in many cases where you have a fire and it heats up the metal that was holding up the building, and it makes it more malleable, and then all of a sudden it can't support the weight anymore. And they had a lot of cascading problems where some of the beams were hit and damaged, and they also knocked some of the fireproofing off, and then so anyway, it's completely it's completely plausible that just that plane knocked it down.
I've always tended to thought that 9/11 was totally legit.
Yeah.
Maybe there was some problems in terms of not trying to stop it as well as we could, whether it's bureaucratic or intentional. Yeah. I tend to think it's still bureaucratic.
If there's going to be a conspiracy, I think it makes the most sense to have it in that regard.
Yeah, we just clearly chose to, like, retaliate.
I care so much more about how we used it to justify our actions afterwards.
Yeah,
that's the real conspiracy, and we know it's true, so...
It's just like, moralistically, we're okay to start a war now.
Yes.
Yeah. Like, I don't know why we should focus on, like, these unanswerable conspiracies instead of the very real implications of the real events. It's
I just wanted to mention that because...
For sure, that is
because I'm actually an engineer, and so I can say with pretty good certainty that, like, I understand what happened.
I appreciate you bringing that in. I always see those those memes being like, well, jet fuel can't burn steel beams. And
you're right, it can, but it doesn't need to. But yeah, anyway, as far as us using that to further our own power and like increase the power of our government even domestically, I definitely think that's reprehensible. But I also wonder what you guys would posit as a reasonable response.
Well, first of all, we should have disclosed the identity of those who participated, which were mostly Saudi Arabians, and there should have been serious political ramifications in that regard, pointing out the extremist nature of the Saudi Arabian government, questioning our alliances with them, things like that. I agree with a general terrorist, defense system or whatever, dealing with that as a threat. But the idea of, like, unilaterally invading countries in the Middle East, I think that's only made the problem worse.
It just... For me, it clearly shows that these people, they decided they were Muslim extremists, right? And so it's one of those things where it's like, this is a clear example of what happens if they become extreme and why you need to make sure that they don't. And
let's also talk about the fact that what's his face, Osama bin Laden was a U.S. asset trained by the CIA during the Cold War. We literally still use fundamentalist Islam as part of our geopolitical strategy, in the sense that the whole underbelly of Russia is the Middle East, and there's a huge percentage of the southern population of Russia that's Islamic. And one of the key American strategic points is to radicalize the Islamists under Russia to cause societal discontent. So, I mean, we've used radical Islam, we've perpetuated it as a political strategy multiple times, including the very person that caused 9/11 to happen.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we have a lot of responsibility in this area.
Well, I'm not trying to say, because again, I'm trying to, like, more stick on the ideas that Sam has, which is like the moral.
Yeah. We're getting too about it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. I mean, it's alright. Like, those are good facts to know, and it's like, it is clearly, like, questionable what we did, but or just bad. But I would say that, like, you can use that example that, like, that they did do something so extreme as a reason why you need to pay attention to those morals and say, these tend to be extreme, when they do, they do tend to be extreme, and when they are extreme, they can lead to crazy amounts of violence. Yeah. And so they're probably not ones that we should continue.
Yeah, I listened to the Joe Rogan with him, and Majid Nawaz was the guy that he worked with.
Wasn't he was a radical Islamist for a long time?
Yeah. And I'm trying to remember his arc. He goes into it a little bit in that, but he actually went to Egypt for a while, and he was living there, not doing anything shady that I am aware of. And then when 9/11 happened, they imprisoned him for 5 years or something like that, just because he was Islamic. So anyway, he comes from an extremist background, and he's trying to reform Muslim culture and Islam in general. But what I was going to say about that is just that the extremist problem is definitely a problem, but a lot of people point to how small of a percentage that is. And one of the things that Sam and Majid both talk about is that extremist Islam, like jihadism, is a problem for sure, but also just normal Islam can be a huge problem. For instance, in the UK, Muslim people in the UK were polled, and they asked them if it was okay for people to have gay marriage, and 0% said yes. 0.
Yeah.
And around 50% of them said that the attack on Charlie Hebdo was valid and warranted.
Which is crazy, yeah.
And that's in the UK. So that's not even in Saudi Arabia, right?
Yeah.
So there's clearly something wrong with the ideology at play.
Right.
And I think that's mostly what Sam is trying to say.
I agree with
Now,
that. And I think, go ahead.
What he parrots about foreign policy and his, maybe unwillingness to question the motives is, I would say, it could be seen as a huge problem.
And
we
our
should look into
contribution to certain,
Yeah, I do think that a lot of people like Noam Chomsky tend to blow that up more than is maybe
I think that's fair.
possible.
And he actually speaks to that.
Yeah.
And he says that, yes, I focus disproportionately on that. But his reasoning for that, which I appreciate and personally I like that reasoning, is the idea that as an American, first and foremost, we're responsible for what our own nation does. And we should be disproportionately focused on our own nation because we can have more impact on that. Criticizing, Islam, what can we do as American citizens about that? But criticizing what we're doing, we can have a much stronger impact on that.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like his main justification for focusing on the problems of our own country.
One thing that I find interesting in sort of response to that is one thing that Sam Harris recommends as a sort of a response to Muslim extremism is to get off of oil, to revamp our economy.
That's super fair.
That's a good one.
That's super fair.
We're completely,
no way.
Well,
no way would we do that.
I mean,
but yeah, I
well,
like it. I mean,
definitely should.
I agree, but there's
Well, that was in that article about the global warming.
Yeah.
It's like we have to revamp our economy.
Coal has to drop to like 6 to 7%
it was
or something
1
like that.
to 7%.
Oh, 1 to 6.
they're saying we
Or let's
essentially
say,
have
something
in
like
the 2020s to have net negative carbon.
Which is not going to happen.
Are we gonna?
I mean, that is true. It's probably
I mean, we could use this as I think a clear thing.
There's more with Sam Harris. Let's go to the climate change thing right after this.
Okay.
But we should. Sam Harris deserves a little more of our time, I think.
I agree. But yeah, I think that argument for what we can do to help Muslim extremism is valid, and I think that it makes sense to talk about it in that context of like, this is a problem, we need to fix it, and here's a way that we can fix it that also solves this other tangential problem.
I agree. I think the reflex with the left, which is done in, I think, a not very good way in the mainstream, some intellectuals like Chomsky, I much more agree with his reflex with it, is a reflex against the portrayal of the Islamic community by the American foreign policy apparatus as kind of like a net green light to interfere in that region in any place for any reason because of a general boogeyman of the Islamic terrorists.
Right.
We use that boogeyman to go into Iraq, even though that particular intervention made no sense within the context of dealing. We're using Islamic terrorism as the justification, but we're not actually trying to deal with it. And in fact, in many circumstances, we're making it worse. And so critiquing that kind of scapegoating is an important part of understanding the dynamics there. I think if you take it too far, which a lot of mainstream leftists will do, and say, like, you don't say anything bad about Islam, that's silly, too.
Yeah.
But can't really escape silliness with regular people a lot.
I agree. Yeah, so the things that I wanted to say about Sam Harris were that, which I already mentioned, is that he's often misconstrued.
He is.
Taken out of context, and he goes on these long thought experiment trains, and then people just grab onto one thing, like nuking Saudi Arabia.
We should talk about that, for sure.
Yeah, so
I didn't even see in the quote anything about Saudi Arabia.
I was nuking some Muslim place.
Yeah.
I should actually pull up the quote because
that'd be good.
But basically, that's not at all what he was advocating for. But what did you want to say about that?
Well, I think it'd be better to read the quote out first. But I guess we're just gonna get into it.
It was Richard Wolff, is that right? Oh no, Chris Hedges, right?
Well, I didn't even hear like Chris Hedges talk about it. I saw the quote online somewhere, but I guess Chris Hedges, because Chris Hedges and him debated, and that wasn't part of their debate. But Chris Hedges has talked about it afterwards. I've seen. But anyway, yeah, he talks about just the. Do you have the quote up?
I do.
Okay, go ahead and read it.
So this is from The End of Faith by Sam Harris. It says, "There's little possibility of our having a Cold War with an Islamist regime armed with long-range nuclear weapons. A Cold War requires that the parties be mutually deterred by the threat of death. Nations of martyrdom and jihad run roughshod over the logic that allowed the United States and the Soviet Union to pass half a century perched more or less stably on the brink of Armageddon. What will we do if an Islamist regime which grows dewy-eyed at the mere mention of paradise ever requires long-range nuclear weapons? If history is any guide, we will not be sure about where the offending warheads are or what their state of readiness is, and so we will be unable to rely on targeted conventional weapons to destroy them. In such a situation, the only thing likely to ensure our survival may be a nuclear first strike of our own. How would such an unconsiderable act of self-defense be perceived by the rest of the Muslim world? It would likely be seen as the first incursion of a global genocidal crusade. The horrible irony here is that seeing could make it so. This very perception could plunge us into a state of hot war with any Muslim state that had the capacity to pose a nuclear threat of its own. All of this is perfectly insane, of course. I have just described a plausible scenario in which much of the world's population could be annihilated on account of religious ideas that belong on the same shelf with Batman, the Philosopher's Stone, and unicorns. That it would be a horrible absurdity for so many of us to die for the sake of a myth does not mean, however, that it could not happen."
See, I have a lot of problems with that.
It's like he personally responded to his own thought experiment in the same statement. It's
He
almost
did.
like at the end, he like got really personal about how he felt about that. So I think that's really the only part he really like fucked up with as far as that goes. Because
Well, my problems with that, there's a few problems I have with that. So,
Okay.
first of all, talking about a regime, so we need to differentiate. Are we talking about like a rogue terrorist group like ISIS getting a nuke, or are we talking about a state, an Islamic state getting a nuke?
Like Iran.
I mean, he
yeah,
just
like
says
Iran or Saudi Arabia.
he just says Islamist regime.
Regime
So-
makes me think a state or a government. And I think the characterization that he's doing of kind of like an Islamic extremist, I don't think would hold up in terms of a government.
Yeah.
I mean,
So-
it really might, but I think the vast majority of the time, those in those positions of power are not going to operate on those principles. They care more about sustaining their power. I mean, if you look at the actions of the Saudi Arabian government, it is in no way in line with, you know, like the Islamic religion that predominates in their region. I mean, they have these big orgies and all kinds of crazy shit. And, you know, they'll work with the United States,
Yeah.
and they care about money and their power and all these different things. Also, if you had a problem with a nuke-bearing enemy that wasn't going to be able to have that détente, a nuclear first strike would never be the option. I mean, you'd send in, you know, something more targeted to deal with the threat of the nukes itself. And I just think the saying that a nuclear first strike would be justified is just so irresponsible to me, especially within the context of the anti-Islamic fervor of American foreign policy. I really just, yeah, that blows me away. I don't think that would happen in an Islamic government. I think they would, you know, care about their continuation and their survival. And if we were to need to get rid of their nukes, I think it would be a more targeted operation, not nuking an area where we would kill untold number of civilians.
well, no, what about defense too? You know, it's like as if they got a nuke and if they used it and shot it at us, like it's not like it's like an unstoppable force,
Well,
right?
his
I mean,
depends.
His
But-
premise was that it was, but that's
I guess,
because that was his thought experiment.
There's also
you know?
So first of all, a regime is specifically a government, especially an authoritarian one.
Okay.
So
So, I mean, we look at Saudi Arabia or North Korea. I mean, these people, when you look at their history, they take actions very much based on the fact that they want to stay in power.
Yeah, they're
I
not
agree with that.
self-destructive.
I agree with that. I think the purpose of this thought experiment is to understand how much of a threat it could pose. And maybe that's unfair because of what you're saying, that if they were to take over an entire state, they might not act like that. But I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that if ISIS could pull together the resources to make a nuke, they would try to.
That's fair.
And so
but again,
we're not ruling out. I don't think it's fair to rule that out as a possibility, because I think they could try to do that, and we could face an instance where we're looking at some organization that possibly does have those values at heart and does possibly maybe not possess, but are working towards the possession of that type of technology.
But even then, I don't think the response would be to nuke them. I think it would be, like I said, a more targeted situation.
Sure.
Whereas when you're talking about like a built-up nuclear state like Russia, if we were going to try to deal with their nukes, we would have no option except to nuke them, because their nuclear facilities are so integrated throughout their society. It's this whole thing.
That's true.
You know, whereas if it was an Islamic State, you know, first of all, they'd probably be more of, you know, a decentralized, you know, organization that wouldn't necessarily have like that strong, infrastructural foundation. I don't know, just just throwing out there, nuclear first strike.
Totally.
I mean, you need to be so careful with that kind of shit. And
I agree.
Even if he would further clarify this, I think it's really irresponsible.
Yeah.
And within the context of these other issues with him dealing with our foreign policy, and I don't know, it just his views on Islam concern me as approaching a form of fundamentalism.
Yeah. Well, okay, so a couple things about just nukes in general. First of all, the biggest thing about nukes is getting the material, the actual radioactive material, and isolating it. So, for instance, uranium comes with 2 isotopes, or maybe even 3 isotopes, that are really difficult to separate from one another. So you typically need centrifuges, and you have to do this over a long period of time, and then you have to worry about storage and all these types of things. So that's where we really detect whether nukes are trying to be made, is in these facilities that are enriching uranium or plutonium. And as far as like, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what it means to be able to make nukes, because I feel like a lot of people think that it's a technological jump, and I think that's pretty naive, because with a couple short Googles on the internet, you can pretty much figure out how to make a nuke. It's not that hard. The concepts are not that difficult to make.
Well, from what I read, the really hard part is like the intercontinental ballistic missiles.
That would be really difficult.
Significantly harder.
Yes, for sure. You know, the
rocket science,
range the rocket science that involved with that is
literal
very complicated.
Rocket science?
Yeah, but exactly, rocket science. So anyway, I think a lot of people have that misconception where making a nuke is hard, and that's wrong. Getting the material to make a nuke and getting the nuke where you want it are the only parts that are difficult. So with that said, I think what Sam Harris is proposing here in this thought experiment is that these people we found out that they've been enriching this uranium, and so we don't really know where, like, how close to being ready these nukes might be. And so it's potentially possible that they would already have one.
Right.
And then the idea that they have a nuke is really scary for a lot of reasons, because maybe they can't get it as an intercontinental ballistic missile, but they might be able to, you know, drive it in a truck somewhere and get it into a city. So it's not necessarily that they could, you know, annihilate us or get it to where it would actually hit us, but that it becomes a huge threat in other ways. So again, I think that's not impossible to poke holes in this logic, and that he is cherry picking a lot here. But
generalizing with literally the most destructive weapon on the planet.
I think
and
the
generalizing the Islamic religion.
Well, I don't think that's unfair, though. I think he's pretty correct in that.
But he's saying that because I mean, ISIS is more of it's a radical group, but he's saying that, isn't he saying that's pretty much India. Any Islamic country that has a nuke is pretty much self-destructive.
He said an Islamist regime, but he does say which grows dewy-eyed at the mere mention of paradise.
So very extreme. He's positing a highly extremist.
It is definitely
regime.
a very extremist regime in that regard. So I think the biggest issue here is what happens to Sam Harris a lot, which is where people don't like the thought experiments that he creates, and they latch on to a lot of these problems that we're picking out. But my interpretation of this is that he's pointing out that these regimes could have really significant negative consequences, and they can get much worse than what we have now. So he's trying to make the case that these are things that we really, really need to deal with. He's not necessarily saying that this scenario is right. Now, I think he could be a lot more careful in doing that, and I think he should. And I agree with you that even tangentially advocating for a nuclear first strike is not a good idea.
Yeah.
Even though he's specifically saying that in the context of how ridiculous that would be.
Right.
I agree that it's kind of irresponsible to do that.
See, I could see so easily with kind of like the the war fervor in the American establishment, especially right now. I mean, there's a lot of neocon war hawks in the Trump administration. I mean, John Bolton is like a psychopath. That guy wants to topple every goddamn government on the he wants to topple Iran. He wants to topple North Korea. He's like a fervent war hawk, American imperialist to the core.
Awesome.
I mean, I could see this kind of argument so easily turn into like we need to nuke Iran right now. With the if you just look at how they're talking about Iran right now, they're wheeling up to go to war with Iran very slowly, and they canceled the nuclear Iran.
Well, they're the most capable of making nukes. That's what
we had the Iran deal with them, which the entire international community said this is a good framework for stopping them to get a nuke, and it's going to ramp up the more that we let go of the sanctions and all these different things. And Trump canceled it, and is now ramping up war talks, re-implementing sanctions. I mean, they're moving to go to war with Iran for geopolitical reasons.
I think Sam Harris would be extremely critical of that, personally,
Probably.
from what I know.
Probably. But that kind of overgeneralized argument against Islam, while I think he has a lot of really good points, I'm just so focused on how that's being used by our imperial apparatus that it just really makes me uncomfortable. And I don't think he looks at that enough to kind of take that into account. I mean, I was watching an interview with him on Joe Rogan, and he was critiquing some things an independent journalist, Abby Martin, who I like a lot, was saying about him, and the Iraq War and stuff like that. And Joe Rogan asked a question where he was like, "Well, have you seen how much, how many civilians are killed by our drone strikes and stuff like that?" I wish I looked at the context of that surrounding argument because I think it was really relevant. But he essentially said, "No, I haven't looked at that." And that kind of thing, it just seems to me that he doesn't look at the other side of it. How are we causing these things to occur? He sees it in a vacuum because he's looking at Islam as a religion as the source of all problems.
Yeah. Well,
in my mind,
I think you're extrapolating a lot. From
I am
because
let me just
because
be clear.
he said specifically that he didn't know the number. That's what he said. Right. So he's aware that we kill civilians, and he knows that for sure. But he just didn't know the number, and he didn't want to say, "Oh yeah, it's this percentage." Right. So I think he's completely aware of that, but he was, in that context, he was critiquing her generalization of the Iraq War and saying that we killed 2 million people and how that was a huge overestimate.
Yeah, those are the highest possible.
Yeah. And she
also picked the far end of the numbers.
And she was just saying a bunch of shit about him. So he was getting maybe a little personally attacked.
But she did
he
first.
Didn't like
she
that.
did first.
And so I think he was mostly trying to get at the points that he felt she was being unfair.
That's fair.
And so I don't think he was focused on that part of the drone strike. But the overall context of that was the morality of war as it's waged now, and him talking about how there is a certain amount of collateral damage that's incurred in war in general. And saying I don't think he was saying that the drone strikes are morally justified, but he's saying that to think that war could be waged without collateral damage is idealistic, and it's just not going to happen right now.
True, but the numbers in the drone strikes, I mean, I think it's 90% civilians. When the drone report that came out of the Senate, it was vast majority of the deaths were civilians. And there were videos that came out of our drone strikes where they would strike a target, and then they'd leave, and they'd wait for first responders to show up, and then they'd bomb it again. There were videos of that got leaked. And I mean, it was fucking insane. There's a part of our drone strategy that is a terror campaign. It's not just trying to eliminate the targets as, carefully and as isolated as we can. And this was an argument that, when he got in an argument with Noam Chomsky via email. So they were debating. Yeah, we should talk about this. I think Chomsky was really flippant with him, and it did bother me.
Before you get into that, though, this figure of 90% that you're pulling out was from The Intercept, and it says, nearly 90% of people killed in recent drone strikes in Afghanistan, quote unquote, were not the intended targets of the attacks. So that's what it said. It doesn't that doesn't necessarily say civilians,
but not the intended target.
but yeah,
which,
not the intended target,
mean,
which is a lot.
Still awful.
But that's also this one report, and there are other reports that are different in terms of the amount of percentage. So we can't necessarily say that it's 90.
If it's even 60%, that's
really high. That's really high. But it's also where this is in the context of people that will specifically use civilians as cover.
That's true.
And so that's something that Sam Harris talks about, where he's like, when you have a situation where one side of the war will use civilians as cover because they know that it will be effective, and the other side wouldn't even think of doing that because they know, one, that it wouldn't even be effective, and two, that it's morally wrong.
Right.
Then you have a huge discrepancy in just the moral values already. And so to equate them moralistically just because we're killing civilians is really wrong.
For sure.
And that was I think that's the problem that Sam Harris has with Noam Chomsky as well, is the moral equivalence problem.
Okay, yeah. So
let's get into that, yeah.
So one of the things there was Chomsky was saying that what we did to Iraq was worse than what the
Sudan. They're talking about Sudan.
Well, they talk about Sudan further in the conversation, but it starts off because Chomsky had in earlier things talked about how what we did to Iraq was worse than what happened on 9/11. So that's how the conversation starts, and then they get more specific talking about Sudan and the Clinton administration.
I'll have to get into that email, because what I remember specifically is Sam Harris critiquing Noam Chomsky's book that he wrote after 9/11, specifically the passage where Noam Chomsky says something about Al-Shifa and the bombing of that, and how it was worse than 9/11. So that's what I'm
pretty sure that was one of the examples they go into, but I'm fairly certain early on in the conversation they start with talking about the Iraq War being worse than 9/11, according to Chomsky.
All right, so we're back.
Okay. Done some quick reading on the emails between Chomsky and Harris.
Which you can find on Sam Harris's website if you're interested in reading more of their exchange.
So I had issues. I mainly came down on Chomsky's side in this discussion in terms of like the morality of it. One of the things Sam Harris brings up over and over in the email exchange is the idea that you can't make a moral equivalency between what we did and what was done on 9/11 or other examples of that kind, because our intentions are different. So one of the things he brings up is that if we had perfect weapons, we would not, like weapons that could kill exactly our target and never a civilian, that would be the case. That we would never kill civilians if we had perfect weapons. And that because of this, because our intentions are good, and it is simply the limitations of our weapons and the inability to use these weapons without causing collateral damage, we're not as morally responsible for those deaths because we don't intend to do it. And I think this view again is a problem where I just don't feel like Sam Harris understands the nuance of American geopolitical foreign policy. He assumes always that we have not always, but he generally assumes that we have the best intentions, and that we're trying not to kill innocents, in all these scenarios, we're always taking that into account. And I just don't think that is at all the case. I mean, whether it's, the invasion of Iraq, or, the amount of non-targets killed by our drone program, or our willingness to put, totalitarian dictators in place in exchange of democratic regimes that don't agree with us in Latin America. I mean, it just goes on and on and on, where we are willing to use the most cynical strategy to achieve our ends, and there's tons of collateral damage, and it's not, in my view, that we are trying to our greatest possible exertion to not do that. I don't think that's the case, and yet his argument is based off that. His whole moral argument is based off the fact that our killing of innocent people is inadvertent. It is not our intention, or that we're trying not to do it. I think, at best, we're willing to turn a blind eye to it, and at worst, we actively use it as a weapon. In many, many, many of our foreign policy decisions, since World War II through today. And the idea that we're not morally responsible for the outcome, or not as morally responsible for it, because our intentions were better, I think is immoral. I think that's a very immoral position. I think you certainly need to account for intentions, but, even if you have the best intentions, if you kill millions of people, you killed millions of people. You should have acted in a more careful way or chosen not to act if you realized you couldn't contain that, unless the circumstances were so dire, that it really couldn't be warranted not to. And that's why I really don't like that argument. And again, Chomsky is always going to be focused on what have we done, because his whole philosophy is about holding our own country accountable.
Right.
Anyway.
Well, first of all, I'd like to make a distinction. If you grant Sam Harris's assumptions, which I recognize you disagree with,
right.
If you grant those assumptions that we weren't trying to do that...
Okay, so assuming we have the best intentions.
Yes.
Okay.
Then what would you say about his moral argument? Do you agree or disagree that you can't draw moral equivalence there anymore?
I agree you can't do a moral equivalence, but I don't even necessarily think that's what Chomsky was doing. I don't think he was saying it's equivalent so much as I think he was trying to say that what we've done is worse because of the scale of damage caused. Mm-hmm. So even if we do have perfect intentions, if the scale of the damage is so much greater, I still think that makes us morally inferior, even if our intentions are better, because we did not do our due diligence and take the responsibility for using our power in a way that would cause that much collateral damage. I mean, that's part of the responsibility of utilizing power.
Can we at the very least say that we should apologize for the civilian deaths? Be like, that wasn't what we wanted to do. That was a bad thing that we had to do, but I felt like we had to do that.
Or some kind of reparation.
Yeah, something like that, That's I can't say that it's like, oh, well, our intentions were good, and so that makes it so that it's okay.
The argument really gets down to, intentions versus outcome. And I think even if your intentions are perfect, the outcome is still, in my view, more important. I mean, it certainly, they're both important.
Yeah.
But, perfect intentions, there's still dead people. And you can justify it.
I don't agree that it's more important, though. Because if you intend to kill millions of people, and you do, then that's way worse than accidentally killing them, in my mind. So, I like what Sam Harris says in this regard, because he says intentions are important insofar as they tell you what a person is likely to do in the future. Right. So, if you intend to kill millions of people, and you successfully do that, you're likely to do it again. But if you don't intend to, and you accidentally do it, your likelihood is much less. And he brings up an example of, a person, like say you have someone in your house who is, helping cook with you, and then they turn around and accidentally stab you, right? That, as compared to somebody on the street who walks up and stabs you and is trying to kill you. The intention tells you a very important thing. What are they likely to do in the meantime? So in the future rather, because the person that stabbed you on the street is going to try to kill you.
I definitely think that's a good point. That being said, another moral principle we have to acknowledge is that power infers responsibility, and therefore the more power you have, the more morally responsible you are for the use of that power. So if we're just wantonly, accidentally destroying millions of lives,
right,
because we have that power, we have a higher moral obligation to use it responsibly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the other thing that I also think that Noam Chomsky points out in many of his other talks is just how much we can actually trust the narrative that our government gives us.
Well, you see, we're in another world right now. We're not talking about that yet. I do want to get to that, but you're now talking about the moral.
It does get into the question of intentions. What are the actual intentions?
Yes,
exactly, but we did want to talk about that.
Yeah, we're talking about it in the perfect case of granting Sam his ideas. Right? Okay. So, and I recognize that it might be weird for people, but just for now, I want to nail down what we think about that, and then we can move on after that. But basically, so in the event that we were right, assuming that we were right, that they had chemical weapons that happened to be at a pharmaceutical plant, that they were pairing those two things. So what then is a real, is a proper response? Maybe I could certainly see put a really good argument for bombing the plant in the middle of the night like we did, and then after that, having realized that
massive
we stopped
aid and
giving them the drugs that they need,
much
they would have gotten otherwise. I can definitely see a huge argument for that.
Much better.
And I think that it's reprehensible that we didn't do anything in the face of...
And the lack of addressing the collateral damage sufficiently
Yes.
shows that our intentions are not what we say they are.
You would
Because if
think.
they were as honest as what we claim,
Yeah.
then we would pursue that much more passionately.
You would think.
I could see that. I don't know that that's necessarily an if-then statement you
Yeah.
can make. I think it's a, that makes more sense.
Right.
But I would say there's a
Could be
perfectly reasonable scenario where they had great intentions and then they fucked up and they were like, well, I know my intentions speak for themselves. I don't need to be groveling at their feet. But I'm not saying that was that's the response they should
But
have.
that's like that is the weird high ground that like we even started the whole Iraq war on, which is just that we have a high ground, like they attacked us first, so we have the high
Which
ground
they
of
didn't
attacking
do.
them back.
And then it was like, well, they have WMDs. Well, they did it.
It's just like,
It just seems like that's. I don't think that should be morally advocated for. Like that's like if someone aggresses you, then then maybe you need to retaliate, but you don't do it like wantonly. You do it because you feel like you have to,
Right.
and you
Well,
be.
That's in this case with the Al Shifa bombing.
Yeah.
They did bomb an embassy before us,
Okay.
and so it was considered a retaliation attack where we were destroying their chemical weapons plant. That's what it was said to be.
Okay.
And at best, we did not sufficiently address the collateral damage that our actions caused.
I agree, and I would say that Sam Harris would also grant that point.
Right.
I just think his biggest thing was that it seemed like Noam Chomsky was saying that those were morally equivalent, and he disagrees with that. And I agree with him. Granting his assumptions that it wasn't that we had pure intentions.
Right.
I think that matters. I think that's more important than Noam Chomsky was alluding to. And so that would be my main agreement with Sam Harris in that regard.
And I think he's right to bring up the importance of intentions. And this is going to get into our own personal moral code.
Yeah.
I tend to fall more on the side of, being far more concerned with what we're doing because it's us kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And, the responsibility we have given the power we hold.
I think being more concerned and more responsible for that is different from drawing moral equivalence, though.
I agree.
Okay.
I agree with that completely.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Now, insofar, like moving on from the thought experiment, I would say we both agree that intentions are important.
Yeah.
And that
So here
it
we
shouldn't be a moral equivalence.
Yes.
But-
But at the very least, both outcome and intentions are important.
Yes, agreed. And I think Sam Harris grants that as well. Definitely, he agrees that the outcome is important too. Just that the intentions can't be just brushed aside. Now, going into what he actually believes about, the narrative that is put
Yeah,
forth.
he seems to grant that we have good intentions, which
Yeah.
is where I immediately get my hackles up, because all my understanding of American history shows that, we, especially in, third world countries, we are more than willing to use the most brutal methods available to accomplish our geopolitical aims.
Definitely.
And, specifically in the Middle East, the atrocities of late have been very alarming.
Well, that's a big thing, is we don't value life over there as much as we value it on our.
But that's how empire works. Getting an empire.
That's
But
how
even, like-
psychology works. You're in group. The people in your group are definitely way higher than the people.
Yeah,
outside
because it's
your
like
group.
us in Europe is like, if anything happens to either of those two, it's just like crazy, like moral, our problems with
Yeah,
it.
they look like us and they sound like us. So.
It's like, oh yeah, we bombed a hospital in Iraq and
Yeah, there is a huge problem
we
with
really
us
give a shit.
Well-
not caring about people who are. The more different they are, the less we care.
What you define as your in-group, that is malleable. You can say, I'm a human, and so I care about human life. Not,
See,
I'm
yeah.
an American, so I only care about American life. Like,
my
that's a choice
my
that
in-group
you can
is
make.
the common people, the universal human experience.
Yeah.
That's my in-group.
Totally.
My out-group is generally those in concentrated positions of power which seek to control the masses. Yeah, that's
And
my
I do think
in-group and out-group.
like, we do have to admit that it becomes more complex and when it comes into a wartime. Because then you have to be like, well, this person's attacking me, so I go into a different mode in that time.
Right.
But yeah, I think that there is an ability that we should be able to distinguish between the people who are going to be aggressing against us and the civilians of the, that are kind of just in the area of those aggressors.
Yeah.
So that's why I would say the apology and stuff. That is obviously the.
And I definitely agree with you on the point that the more power we should come with, the more responsibility, right? I mean, that makes sense, and I think we have a tendency to wield it without thinking about that, you know. And
well, if anything, I think there's also an ideology around the idea of the opposite, which is like, we're the biggest dog on the block, so we can do what we want. Which is saying we have less responsibility because we're more powerful.
Right.
Which is deeply immoral, in my
I disagree
opinion.
with that as well. Yeah, and I do think
that's very much manifested in the whole Trump ideology.
Yeah.
That's the
I
America
think that
first.
was like the high ground that I was talking about too. It's like,
and I agree that, you know, everything that we've done in the Latin American countries and toppling governments,
Might makes right.
all of that kind of stuff is really reprehensible, and most of the time it has been for our own interests and against the interests of the people there, which is fucked up. And we should, you know, a lot of that was done under the guise that we were trying to subvert communism, and, you know, doing the Cold War, we needed to make sure that, you know, they didn't get too many countries and whatever. But it was a lot of hand waving in that, you know. It's like, oh, they're becoming communists, or
and it's a lot about you know, strategic or economic interests.
Yeah.
And you know, you can see that very clearly with the overthrow of very democratic governments, whether they're in Latin America or the Middle East, to put in authoritarian dictators as long as they bend U.S. economic and political interests.
Totally.
Which really, you know, puts the lie to the whole humanitarian notion of our hegemony.
Yeah.
It is an empire. It's about power.
Totally.
It's about, you know, maintaining the status quo. And anything that upsets that, no matter how democratic or good for its people, if it upsets the balance of power we've established, they're the enemy. And destroy them.
I agree. But, so I think we're getting away from talking about Sam Harris, which is fine. Like,
But we are talking about the intentions of U.S. power.
Well, I think one of the biggest things too is that if we can make this deduction from like the actions of America, it also comes to question whether Sam has like really analyzed that before really siding with America.
That's what bothers me. Is like, in him claiming that our intentions are good, it seems to me that's where it starts to get tribalistic to me. It seems he's picked teams, and one team is bad and the other team is good, and that's what I sense from his argumentation in an email exchange like this, is that he has that tribalistic view about it, which makes me very nervous.
Well, so specifically with the email, again, there's this kind of contextual problem that he has, because he starts off the email exchange mostly just trying to nail down what Chomsky thinks and trying to debate this one point. And Chomsky keeps throwing out all these other things that he wants Sam to address, and Sam's kind of like, well, I need to get this figured out first, but he doesn't ever say that.
Chomsky was not...
And so Chomsky is like jumping on that, like, you still haven't answered this, and he's saying a lot of really, like...
Chomsky was not being conducive to it.
No, he was being a dick in a lot of ways. And he was an asshole in a lot of ways. He was like, you still haven't said this, and he said a lot of things that, I mean, there gets to one point where Sam is basically like, I urge you to, you know, look at how you're responding here, because I don't think that like your fans would appreciate the tone that you're taking with me here. And it's very interesting.
I should read those for sure.
It's a good exchange to read for that reason, I think. But anyway, all that is to say that I think it's hard to get a good representation of what Sam Harris really thinks on all this, because he was trying to drill down on this one point. And so I feel like a lot of what he brings up in that is mostly just about that. Like, he's not trying to disseminate his entire view of foreign policy and how the American government has behaved. He grants a lot of what Chomsky says, in fact, about how reprehensible we've been in the past. And so I think in this particular case, he finds it difficult to believe that Bill Clinton, you know, organized that strike knowing that it would kill that many people and not caring. Like, that just that's just not what he thought happened. And I think it's fair in single cases like that to hold that kind of perspective.
That's fair. But
I think overall, I do think he is critical of how we, you know, throw our power around. And I think he talks about that in other cases, you know, other parts of the book. And so I would say that I think partly what's going on is a misrepresentation of his views. But I would agree that he probably hasn't looked into some of these things as much as maybe would be better if he did, you know.
And I do think an underlying theme in Sam's responses makes me feel like pushing him on his views on American empire and American foreign policy would be good.
I agree. That would be awesome. I would love to hear him talk more about that. And there's actually some talk of him doing a podcast with Chomsky. Apparently Chomsky has said something about that. So, like, Sam Harris actually went out and asked he tried to start this email exchange and it didn't go well, and he basically aborted it. But apparently, Chomsky has said something about maybe being willing to do a podcast with him. And so,
I love it. I love it.
Yeah, that would be sweet.
It'd be great.
I would be very interested to hear
It'd be
that.
better in person than over.
Oh yeah.
Because I think what happened was Chomsky read what Sam wrote about him, got very defensive and flippant, and it just was not conducive to discussion. That's what I think happened.
Yeah, this one email here is from Sam Harris. Is like, no, I'm hard-pressed to understand the uncharitable attitude, really bordering on contempt, conveyed by almost everything you've written thus far. What is it adding to the discussion? If you want some disinterested feedback, we might pass this exchange along to Lawrence and Joanne, as you suggested below. I believe they will echo my concern and tell you that you are not doing yourself any favors here. Your last email is as strangely prickly as the others. If you haven't written about my work, why not just say so, rather than act like you've sprung a trap on me? I never assumed you had written about me. In fact, I assumed you hadn't. So what is the point of this reciprocation business?
Yeah.
And,
There's a
so
lot of tit for tat.
just goes into that about like how he's just kind of being a dick and he's not sure why. But anyway, so yeah, I would love to see them talk in person and hopefully break down some of these walls that they set up and couldn't get.
Well, it's all and it's very classic for you to become like way more critical and defensive if the person's not there.
Yeah, definitely.
So before we leave public intellectuals and political commentators, real quick, just for those interested in the kind of left-wing perspective that I'm talking about, my two favorites that I think are on the more reliable side. So Secular Talk with Kyle Kalinski's, I think that's very good. One that's done by a comedian, so it's a lot more commentary than news. Jimmy Dore Show. I think Jimmy Dore's great. Both of them have been on the Joe Rogan Show, so you should check them out on Joe Rogan. Kyle Kalinski and Jimmy Dore. They're great as far as commentary goes. But yeah.
Okay. And I would like to add to that I really like Bret Weinstein a lot, and I think listening to his talks is really informative. He's got a lot of really good stuff. And I sent both of you, both Dan and Sean, a clip from him. I don't know if you guys watched.
Yeah,
it.
I didn't get all the way through it, but I started with just the whole like day of walkout stuff. So that was
there's
really
a lot to know there. I'd actually like to send you guys a talk that he gave that was basically about like a reflection of that, and I think we should talk about that. That's actually something that Chris recommended that we talk about on the podcast. I think there's a lot of really good commentary on the left in there, and just the current political climate that we can get into.
But I am excited about the idea of these more leftist thinkers getting involved in this intellectual network, because now that Joe Rogan has had on Kyle Kalinski and Jimmy Dore, Jimmy Dore has interviewed Chris Hedges, he's interviewed Richard Wolff, and now Richard Wolff knows about Jordan Peterson and is challenging him to a debate. So I'm really excited about this kind of, richening of the discussion.
Another interesting thing, now that we're getting nerdy as fuck and getting excited about possible debates between intellectuals in the future, apparently Bret Weinstein might be debating Richard Dawkins on the evolutionary advantages of religion.
Okay, another
Sounds
really
fucking
good
awesome
one.
to me.
One of the best debates I've ever seen was between Chris Hedges and Richard Dawkins. Talking about religion in general. That was absolutely incredible. And I think Chris Hedges did a good job poking through some of the holes in kind of like the new atheist movement and its blind spots in a way that most people aren't able to. But anyway, check that out. I thought that was really good.
Yeah. The new atheism, I think, goes a little too far in some critiques, but
we can also link all of this stuff in the video.
Yeah, anything we mentioned, I'm going to put in the description. So just go ahead and look down, and I'll put them in order that we mentioned them.
Sweet. I'll send you some links. Cool. So I think that's about all I had to say on the intellectuals. I like the Weinsteins.
The first topic.
Yeah. I mean, it obviously branched into a lot of other topics, but holy fuck, we're slow. And we are definitely going to have to table some of this. So I guess the next question would be, what should we try to cover next? Because we may only get one other topic.
We're at 2.5 hours.
Guns?
Okay.
Does Sam Harris talk about guns?
He does. He actually has a full podcast where he kind of outlines his views on guns and gun control. And then he has another one where he has two other ones that kind of talk about violence in a tangential way. So he has a blog post on violence, which I'll give to Dan so he can link. And I think it's a really, really sober look at the world and how, like, mostly the U.S. world, I should say. But just like the possibility of violence, the recourses that people should have ready, and the sort of perspective people should have of violence and how to deal with it. I think he does a really good look at that. And then he has a podcast with Jocko Willink, which is he's a former Navy SEAL, and so that's an interesting perspective on the Iraq War in one regard, and also on violence. And then he has another one with a guy named Scott Reitz or something like that, who is a former SWAT officer, and he talks about it from the sort of like the police standpoint and how guns and gun control sort of talk a little bit about that, but also they talk just about how the police are thought of and that kind of stuff. So I think that was a really good look at that.
We should definitely do a whole thing just on criminal justice.
That would be excellent.
But that's got to be another day.
But yeah, I mean, if we want to do guns, I'm totally down for that. I got a lot of shit on that.
I think that'd be a good one to do. Another one we should do if we don't do it right now, at least after guns, is more on censorship. Because, especially speaking of public intellectuals, there's a real risk here that some of these people are going to start getting censored. I mean, they've already name-dropped some of them, talking shitty about the intellectual dark web in articles. Yeah. This most recent thing was like 800 American bloggers or content creators were purged from YouTube and Facebook.
Jesus.
They put out a New York Times article saying something like, now Americans are taking moves out of the Russian playbook on disinformation. So they're tying this McCarthyist purge now into...
They actually they deleted the accounts?
Yeah, and so many of them had nothing to do with Russia at all. So things like anti-war pages were taken down, pages that post about police brutality in the United States were taken down, and also right-wing and left-wing. And now, people like Jimmy Dore and Kyle Kalinske, who are anti-establishment, are saying, dude, we had to check to see if our page was still up.
Jesus.
This is getting bad.
That's really bad.
Well, I know, YouTube and stuff has been doing that to, radical right or left.
Yep.
That just any radical group, but they haven't been taking them down, but they've just been getting rid of their ads.
See, but that's how it started. It started with YouTube Apocalypse, where they started demonetizing people that talked about controversial topics.
Right.
And then it moved into the Russian purge, where, Russian bots and stuff like that. And then there was the algorithm purge by Google. So anti-establishment sites, lost 60% of their traffic because algorithms would, deprioritize non-establishment outlets. Yeah. And now it's the outright taking down of even American pages.
Jesus.
So it's getting really scary.
That reminds me of a hat that I saw. It was the red Trump hat, and it said, "Make Orwell fiction again."
But the Democrats are playing right into this by allowing the Democratic Party to trumpet this bullshit about Russia and, to deflect away from their own culpability for the election that resulted in Trump, and to try and distract away from any of the core issues, going on here. And it's fucked up, man. They saw that they couldn't control the people anymore in 2016, and they're trying to clamp down on political freedom. That's all I'm saying.
Well, and that would be, I think it would be really interesting to see what would happen if they did kind of take down the intellectual dark web.
Dude, I mean, this is the pattern it's followed so far, is they start posting articles linking them to the alt-right, linking them to the radical left, linking them to Russia, and then they keep trumpeting that, and then they take them out.
It's just these guys get 160,000 views on in a day or two.
One of the bloggers I followed that got taken down had 70,000 followers.
That's
I mean, this is getting pretty crazy. Multiple page I followed got taken down during this.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that Eric Weinstein talks about is the McCarthyism that's definitely going on, which is
and it's fucked up because a lot of people on the left, they cheered for Alex Jones.
Yeah,
and that's how it starts, bro. And it's not a constitutional issue. They'll go, "Oh, it's just a private business," and it's no, but you're setting a norm. You're setting the mechanism in place. You're normalizing this. You're saying it's okay for them to do it. You need to have a backlash to this.
Well, and then you just hope that there will be a counter outlet for it. Be okay, well, if YouTube's not going to post it, then this other place will post it.
But they're monopolies.
Right.
So then that gets again into what we were saying earlier about, should these be public utilities? How do we deal with that? How do we create that public space?
Totally.
So since we're on this already, I want to there's only one more part of this to really cover. So the big tech companies have been working with various government agencies in order to determine which of these pages or groups to take down. one of the main think tanks they've been working with is the Atlantic Council. And the Atlantic Council is essentially a NATO think tank, so it involves like Europeans and Americans, former national security officials. Dick Cheney's in it. Some neocons like Bill Kristol and Henry Kissinger are in it. So people like that. They put out a report that I linked to you guys, and I want to read a few bits from it.
Pretty scary.
But it'll take me a second to find it.
That is scary.
Here we go. So one of the things that this is all from a report that came out of the Atlantic Council, and you can look it up. It's like Sovereign Challenge Report 091.
We'll link it.
Yeah, I'll link it too. And it's just essentially about the need for media censorship. So here's some quotes from it. Technology has democratized the ability for sub-state groups and individuals to broadcast a narrative with limited resources and virtually unlimited scope. By contrast, in the past, the general public had limited sources of information, which were managed by professional gatekeepers. When radical and extremist views and incorrect ideas are broadcast over social media, they can even influence views of people who would not otherwise be sympathetic to that perspective.
Oh my God.
Watts warns, when forwarded by a close friend or relation, false information carries additional legitimacy. Once accepted by an individual, this false information can be difficult to correct.
Wow.
Eliminating those individuals and organizations will not be sufficient to combat the narrative and may in fact help amplify it. He adds, this is also the case for censorship, as those behind the narrative can use the attempt to repress the message as proof of its truth, importance, or authenticity. Technology giants, including Facebook, Google, YouTube, and Twitter, which can determine what people see and do not see, are vital to this. I didn't quote the whole thing. So it goes on.
But yeah.
Watts adds, fortunately, shifts in the policies of social media platforms, such as Facebook, have had significant impact on the type and quality of the content that is broadcast. Business and private sector may not naturally understand the role they play in combating disinformation, but theirs is one of the most important. In the West, at least, they have been thrust into a central role due to the general public's increased trust in them as institutions. So one of the most disturbing things in it too is they correlate the rise of the internet and they compare it to the rise of the printing press in Enlightenment Europe, and they say that development was negative because it caused instability and suffering and political discontent. So they're saying that the French and American revolutions, the end of feudalism and monarchy, and the rise of our current Enlightenment era was negative because it caused instability from the point of view of government power. Yeah. And they point to that as a justification for us needing to tamp down the internet now.
Holy fuck.
I mean, we were talking about freaking Sam Harris and his beliefs on Islam. It's like, what is this?
Yeah.
This is like way worse than that. Yeah. It's like, oh, yeah, maybe we should like talk about how there's some bad things about this religion, and this is like, yeah, maybe we should talk about like people sharing ideas is bad.
And
there's also a lot of censorship in Islamic regimes.
Totally,
but yeah. I mean,
I just mean that it's
censorship in general is a huge problem.
Well, the critique of there not being the availability of an idea, right? It's I mean, this is the freedom of speech thing that like Jordan Peterson and all of
Sam Harris is huge on that too.
Yeah, it's like that is what it is. It's like there should be some things that are not talked about, and we should be able to decide what those things are.
Yeah, Sam Harris actually briefly mentioned the whole, YouTube, Google type thing, and whether or not that should be thought of as like a public utility, like we were talking about.
Yeah, it in
some way. I think there's a huge advocation to be made for that.
It is the place where modern political discussion happens. Yeah. It is the modern day amphitheater. Definitely. Are there problems with purchased voices in terms of bots and various things like that? Yeah, but I think that the problem far more arises from domestic sources than international ones. I mean, think how much the message is manipulated by our own political parties or corporate interests. I mean, I think that probably is a way bigger problem.
It's crazy.
Well, but in the freaking assessment that just was read, that's a good thing.
Yeah, and
literally, they don't say this is what we mean, but that is what that says.
It was crazy too. So groups that were at the meeting of this Atlantic Council report included like the New York Police Department, and they wrote up like a list of like concerning sites, and gave them to the tech community. And then in this most recent purge, it included a ton of pages on police brutality. Big shocker. And then, of course, all these anti-war things right as we're ramping up to get into the war with Iran.
This is fucking crazy.
Wow. Holy fuck.
Yeah. And it's being barely talked about. I think the only people in mainstream that talked about it was like The Guardian and The Intercept.
Or they got censored already.
Yeah. And then the New York Times talked about it, but justifying it.
Oh, Jesus.
Yeah.
Wow, they justified
Yeah, they
it.
said Americans are now using Russian playbook tactics and
Right.
talking about, just the most egregious examples. They cited things like, spreading things with multiple accounts to try and increase their influence. It's like, that's marketing. Who doesn't fucking do that?
Yeah.
It's just a bunch of bullshit, dude. It's scary.
This is terrifying.
Good thing we're doing this. The right of people to speak out about their political rights or about their political views is under threat. So the fact that we're sitting down to do this thing, I think, is hugely vital.
We don't get censored.
Maybe
Jesus
our goal
fuck.
should be to become, outspoken enough that we get censored.
That's
Well, what
maybe.
I keep thinking about is like
Fuck.
Google's constitution that they kind of made up, or their like morals to
Yeah.
follow. Like
Yeah.
one of them is "Don't be evil," and it's
They
just
removed
They scrubbed
They
that,
removed
right?
that, yeah.
oh, so now it's okay to be evil, I guess.
Yeah, and now they're making a censored version of Google for China. So now we know
They
for...
made that a thing,
Yeah.
and now
Yeah.
it's not anymore.
Yeah.
It's Dragonfly. It's
Yeah.
called Google Dragonfly.
No,
No, I
the
mean-
Don't Be Evil thing. Yeah, it's not in their
no,
mission statement
but they
anymore.
had the no
Yes.
evil,
Yeah.
and
Yes.
then they took out the no
Yes.
evil.
And now
Isn't
now
that
they're
suspicious?
making a censored version of Google for China, which shows that they don't have an inherent principle of free speech. They're going to go where the money is.
Yeah.
So if our government pushes them hard enough, they'll censor us.
Yeah.
The dark side's so strong.
Seriously, it's
It is
crazy.
so strong.
It's terrifying. This reminds me of you all Noah Harari's talk on fascism and how we have to be really careful who has our information, because whoever has the information is ostensibly the government.
Yeah, we are
And
ruled
they
by a
can-
corporate state.
Yeah, they can essentially control whatever they want. At that
So,
point.
one of the most prominent political philosophers of the 21st century, Sheldon Woolen, he referred to our current political organization as inverted totalitarianism, in that it's not like classical totalitarianism, which is expressed by a charismatic leader. It's inverted totalitarianism because it's expressed by the anonymity of the corporate state. And that we need a new term for it, because it's a form of totalitarianism that hasn't happened yet.
Interesting. We're going to talk about guns now. So I guess we could just start by having everyone tell us what you think about guns. And let's start with just specifically gun control. Like, what are your views on that? And we'll start there. Why don't you start for us, Sean?
So for me, I definitely believe in like the Second Amendment. We should be able to have guns. I think with gun control, my stance is it's kind of the same thing with capitalism. I think there needs to be some kind of like some checks for people to buy guns. They can't be as easy to obtain as they are today. I'm not sure what those checks are yet. I know for sure, like, we should do more extensive background checks, but maybe even more of, like, psychological checks. Where it starts getting the gray zone for me is taking guns away from people that have, like, mental illnesses. Because where do you draw that line where that person's depressed, you take their gun away? Or that person, So, I mean, that's my stance. But I agree with, like, minimizing, like, bullet capacity, the automatic weapons.
It's more
Do you
moderate regulation.
Well, what do you mean specifically by automatic weapons?
So full auto.
Okay,
I think
that's already limited.
semi-automatic.
Isn't it legal in some states, though?
No,
like-
it's federally illegal to have a fully automatic weapon unless you have a Class 3 weapons permit, which is...
So is that law enforcement?
law enforcement
Military.
can have them. You can get it as a civilian, but it's really difficult. It's really expensive, and you have to go through a lot of, like, a huge background check and stuff.
But then we have laws where, like, you can't tape another magazine to the back of another magazine for, like, easy reload. And then you have to, like, there's a lot of laws for 10 magazine rounds.
10 rounds per mag.
Yeah.
No
So, I mean,
magazine
I
bigger than
agree
that.
with all of those. I mean, yeah, that's my stance. I think I just want to talk more about if you guys agree with, like, having more checks and balances for when people are ready to buy a gun, and maybe extending that period to, and maybe even having to go to a safety class I don't know.
So, first, before we concede those, what do you propose in terms of like magazine capacity limitation and the semi-automatic weapons?
So I mean, those are more just to cut down on if somebody wants to create like a mass shooting, it would be harder for them to do it. They either need a lot of guns all loaded, or they have to have a lot of, be really efficient with changing magazines. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're just cutting down the factor that somebody can spray 100 bullets, from a crazy big machine gun.
Sure. Well, I definitely think that there's good reason to limit fully automatic weapons. I would say that the effect of limiting magazine capacity is pretty minimal in terms of the reduction of violence.
So I agree. I think the biggest step, I think those somewhat work, but the biggest step is before you let somebody have a gun, I think we need to come up with some kind of test. Mm-hmm. We already do a small background check, but that's pretty much if you're a felon or have assault charges.
Yeah, basically only a felony, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
but then you're checking the well-being of a human being, and so where do you draw that line that they're able to own, because you're it's a constitutional right.
Right.
So where can you draw that line saying we're taking that
right
away? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's also interesting because I think a lot of people, when they talk about gun control, they have the idea of limiting mass shootings in mind. So I think it's not unwarranted, right? Those are bad things. We don't want them to happen anymore, and we should definitely be trying to mitigate that. But from the perspective of limiting violence as a whole and reducing the number of murders with guns, mass shootings are essentially a rounding error on top of the actual homicides that get committed with guns. So I think it's important to distinguish between the purpose of your legislation. So if you want to limit mass shootings, is that your goal? Or if you want to limit just just gun violence on the streets, if that's your goal. Because those have fundamentally different ideas behind them. And I think
definitely the main animating force in the desire for more legislation is around mass shootings and specifically school shootings.
Yeah, I would agree.
The killing of children is definitely unacceptable.
So, before we get into the specifics of laws around trying to deal with that, I want to ask if you guys think that it's a good idea to have armed guards at schools. What do you think about that?
I think so. I know they have it at most high schools nowadays.
Obviously, they got to be well trained. That's a huge part of.
Right.
I think that's a huge problem with the police and security guards in general is they just don't have good training, and so we need to make sure that they're really well trained. But if they are well trained, I think Sam Harris, this is one of the things that he talks about, where if you're at your work that's like a gun-free zone and there's somebody going through the offices shooting everybody, you're not gonna in that moment be thinking, man, I'm so glad that no one here has a gun besides this dude. Right? Yeah. So I think making gun-free zones is fundamentally ineffective and honestly counterproductive in a lot of ways.
There is definitely that argument, to fight a gun, you need a gun.
Yeah. And people often point out that having somebody with a concealed weapon around when there's a shooting, they're just going to have the possibility to shoot civilians, or they're just going to add to the chaos, or when the cops get there, they're going to think that it was him.
I have heard police departments put out that line of reasoning.
Yeah, I think it does in some ways complicate their job, but when you talk about actually wanting to stop shootings before they happen, you got to have somebody there that has the capability to do that.
And I do think we should do more concealed carry for... it goes back to a check. People that apply for it, we should give guns to people that have proven themselves to be good people in society.
It's funny because people with concealed weapons permits actually commit fewer crimes than cops do. So there's really this fundamental confusion, I think, about what giving people concealed weapons permits actually does. So I think the argument against concealed weapons is pretty unfounded in most cases. And I think having gun-free zones you're really just guaranteeing that guy doesn't have to worry when he walks in there. You know, they're just saying like, oh, there's no guns in there. Great. I don't even need my bodyguard today.
That being said, the idea to me that the solution to our crazy school shooting problem is to have armed teachers. I mean, it's just so gross to me. I don't know. I feel like there's more root issues than that, and I feel like that's just.
I don't think that's the solution either. But I do think if the teacher wanted to go through a rigorous course,
self-sought. But the idea that that's the solution to this problem really grosses me out.
I agree with that too.
Do you think that it hinges on guns? Do you think that that's do you feel like that's the factor that needs to be focused on at school shootings? Like, I get that without.
I don't know. This isn't a topic I have a firm stance on. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of different arguments going on here. I think more to do with the problem with school shooting. I think the availability of guns is part of why it happens. But I think it has a lot more to do with the, socio-economic turmoil in this country. I think it has a lot more to do with the disenfranchisement of, especially white males. And let me be clear when I'm saying that, we're transitioning out of an era where, white men expected that they'd be able to go into the workforce and get a job with a living wage and raise a family on one income. And, now we have, we need two income households, gender relations are changing. There's a lot of economic distress and political disenfranchisement. Combine that with the fact that our culture is pretty violent. I think there's just a lot of bigger issues at play. And I don't think just dealing with guns is going to solve the problem, although I think the availability of guns in that context certainly contributes.
I agree with you in a lot of ways. I think bans on any type of gun, I think trying to... I think the talk about gun control in the broadest sense is really a distraction from the underlying problems that cause these kinds of things. So specifically when we're talking about mass shootings, right? Yeah. So you think about the legislation that's been proposed to try and mitigate some of this, like anything that sort of looks like an assault rifle you can't have, or no semi-automatic weapons, or let's limit magazine capacity. These ideas are pretty unfounded in terms of their actual possible effect. So when you look at what it takes. So, I mean, this is going to sound, it almost borders on like an advocacy for no guns at all, because the idea that that's going to limit someone's ability to kill a bunch of people with guns is pretty stupid. If somebody spends a little bit of time with different types of guns, you start to get the sense that having a 30-round clip is nice, but you don't need it. So, what I'm trying to say here is that, not that I think that we should ban all guns, and not that I think that having a 30-round clip limited wouldn't necessarily help a little, but mostly that it's not going to do that much. And I think people are going to be surprised by how little it does. So, for instance, the Virginia Tech shooting was done with handguns, right? So you can limit the clip size of a handgun too, but again, you're limiting it to 10 in most cases, which is, if you try to limit it more than that, you're starting to get into a self-defense argument where people that want to have handguns for self-defense have problems. And if you don't limit it, or if you leave it at 10, you're looking at somebody bringing 2 or 3 handguns and having the same kind of possibility. And having a rifle isn't necessarily an advantage in these close quarters encounters. Maybe it was for the Vegas guy, but he had fully automatic weapons anyway, so you're looking at a completely different case where the law probably wouldn't have helped anyway. And then again, you have the ability for someone to use a shotgun, which is probably fundamentally more effective in these kinds of cases. And even a pump-action shotgun could be fired with a roughly the same speed as a semi-automatic shotgun with very little training. I mean, maybe a couple days.
Did the Vegas guy have full auto? I thought he just had the bump stock.
You're right.
To make semi-automatic feel more like a full auto.
You're right. He did have a bump stock. I misspoke.
So he had an illegal. I know Nevada. I guess I can't say that. But you can get things in Nevada that you would be illegal in other states, especially round magazines. You can get bigger capacity.
Yeah, I'm certainly not above limiting the capacity, but I also think that it's more of a distraction, and it's also it's a distraction in 2 ways. One is only focusing on mass shootings and that's a very small percentage of the actual gun violence. Which again, it's horrific, and we should try to limit it however we can, without being ridiculous. But I think that mostly it's a distraction because that's not really what's causing the problem. Sure, like getting rid of the gun show loophole and making it so that there's some sort of like mental health check on whether or not you could have a gun would be good. But even then, you're looking at a friend having a gun that you take, or like if these people really want to get the weapon, they're probably going to find a way, and it's really hard to make it so that they couldn't. And I feel like even more extensive background checks is not going to stop that problem. So I think the fundamental approach to solving the actual school shooting problem is with mental health and economic wellness. Because like if you make it so that people aren't poor and they have access to mental health counseling if they need it, then I feel like the incidence of this goes way down.
Yeah.
And then also the media's treatment of these.
See, that's a huge thing too. We have not only is the media incredibly sensationalist,
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you have a culture that glorifies celebrity,
Yeah.
and those are bad.
And violence. in a lot of ways,
violence,
too.
and
Like,
those
if
are
you
all
look at
bad
our movies,
combos. Yeah.
we aren't allowed to see, genitalia, but we can see someone's head getting blown up.
Yeah, what's
and
John
it's
Lennon?
no big deal.
We have to make love in darkness, but we make violence in plain sight.
Yeah,
Something
exactly.
Like
I mean, Alan Watts says the same thing.
Yeah,
It's like-
it's pretty silly.
And there's, I'm in favor of trying these smaller reforms, and I think the biggest thing is it needs to be studied more in depth. I mean, the CDC is not allowed to study gun violence.
That is pretty silly.
And I think
Anytime you limit what people can study, I think you're wrong.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest issues too is it's kind of become a political football.
Yeah, it's a huge one.
And you have a problem where the people that know or more advocating for gun rights aren't trying to solve the problem.
Yeah.
So you have people on the right who are just like, no, shut up, don't talk about it. And so then people on the left who don't know what the fuck they're talking about, because generally they're not gun owners, but they're just like, dude, our kids are being shot. Like, we need to do something. So they're just like, fucking try anything. I don't know. And so I really think the impetus is on those who have more knowledge and more advocacy for gun rights to be more energetically trying to apply potential solutions to the problem.
I agree.
As far as like...
I think they need to articulate better why their solutions that are proposed won't work, because they typically just say that's asinine.
It just becomes a tribal tit for tat.
Exactly.
And that's not going to solve the problem. But
But
another real quick thing I want to throw in,
Good.
when Dwight and I was talking earlier about the socioeconomic context, I would really advocate for people to check out Chris Hedges' new book, America: The Farewell Tour, because what he talks about is that in declining societies, it unleashes this psychological phenomenon we've seen a lot in history called the enemy, or the death instinct, and the way that declining societies kind of like unleash symptoms of that, and that one of those might be the rise of mass shootings as economic displacement
Interesting.
and other things.
I just think to get a gun, it's too easy. I mean, so there's mass shootings, but I think there's also just like gun accidents is huge. You're not even required to go through a training course on the gun you get. You wait for your background, takes like a week or two, and then you get your gun. You pick it up at a store.
A lot of times, especially in states that are more lenient, there's no waiting period. So
Is there no background?
there's a background.
There's a background.
There's always a background check. That's federally mandated, but the waiting period is state by state, and lots of states don't have one.
So you can walk out with the gun, but then they
same
might take it back.
No. The background check happens
Okay,
within
it
like
has to.
40 minutes.
Okay.
That's how it goes. So, I mean, I agree that we should definitely standardize, and we should make it harder to get a gun than just walking in and passing a background check. I advocate for essentially like a driver's license for guns,
Exactly.
and you re-up it every
totally.
5 years or something like that, because it makes no sense that if you have 40 guns and then you go to buy a new one, you have to get a background check. Like, you already have 40 guns. Like, it doesn't matter if you get another one, right? But if you have a license that you just have like there's a few things that you have to do to maintain it, and then every however many years you have a retraining or a test or whatever to make sure that you're psychologically well off still, and that I feel like that's reasonable. I don't like it in a lot of ways because it's a little, it's intrusive. But it's also
the counter
you have to do
argument
that for a driver's license anyway.
The counter argument is going to be, well, driving is a privilege, but gun ownership is a constitutional right. So that's going to be the argument there. I personally agree with you. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah.
It makes sense to me.
Well, we already limit gun ownership anyway. In terms of, like, if you're a felon, you can't have it.
Well, I mean, on principle, there's obviously limits to the right to bear arms because, you can't have a tank or you can't have a bazooka.
Yeah.
So, the principle is already there. It's just a matter of where's the line.
Yeah. I think there's definitely a lot of qualms that I have about government oversight in general and them having the right to say no to my right,
Right.
But I think it's not unreasonable. You could set it up in such a way that it wouldn't be unreasonable. And if you were able to do that in terms of, you pass a safety exam and psychological wellness and then the background check and then you get your license. And
See, I agree with the safety and the background. The hard part that I think people would disagree with is the psychological test.
yeah, that's a really tough one.
And
It's
that's
hard to
where
set
we
up.
need more studying
We need it a lot.
on how our brains work and
Yeah, and there's no justification besides purely political motives for not, doing all the due diligence of research that we can.
Yeah.
There is psychological testing going on right now for that, though. There's you can't do research into the data, like CDC can't, but I know people here at OSU that are doing what happens when you see someone with a gun, what do you do, or how is your attention fixated on a gun versus the person holding the gun. There's plenty of that kind of stuff.
The thing that comes to my head is if you're depressed and you maybe even have thoughts of suicide and you say that to the person, are they going to say you can't own a gun? Is that enough justification?
Yeah, where to draw the line is definitely an interesting topic, and I think suicide.
They could buy a knife and commit
suicide is the other thing that it's a different topic for me because I might trip over myself here. I don't.
Careful now.
I know. Right? It's one of those times. If I was famous enough, I'd get misquoted by this. But I'm thankfully.
Hey,
no
we're
one
still
knows
in that
who I am.
that wonderful green zone.
I know, right? So, taking away a weapon from somebody that's suicidal, I don't want to say that that's bad because, I think most people that are suicidal, if they get the proper help, can be brought out of that. And I think that's definitely what they should do rather than kill themselves. I think they should seek out help. And I think that it should be way easier to get that help in our society.
Yeah.
And we need to do whatever we can to remove the stigmas around getting that help.
Well, mental health in this country in general is just atrocious.
It's abysmal.
Yeah.
And it's despicable that
Some
it
of the
is that
worst
bad.
in the developed world.
So that, I think, is the main thing that I think about with that. It's hard for me to want to say that if you're depressed, you shouldn't be able to have a gun. That's really hard for me to say. I think the clearest line is that if there's any indication that a professional has that you could harm somebody else on purpose, that's when I would say you shouldn't have your gun anymore. But as far as just being depressed, maybe there could be mandatory counseling or something like that. But I wouldn't say that you should take it away from them.
I'm relatively certain that and this is, obvious. So if you have depression, or saying that you're clinically diagnosed with that, is that what we're saying here? Because how are they supposed to know if you're not clinically diagnosed?
Yeah, maybe
And
not
most people go
clinically.
undiagnosed.
Yeah.
But even if we're going down that trick, I'm pretty sure that I'm relatively certain that clinical psychologists, if they do hear that you're telling them that you want to harm someone and where it's going to happen and when you're going to do it, then they can tell the authorities.
Yeah.
But before then,
it's pretty blatant.
even then you can't really do it.
Yeah.
There's a lot. And it's important that you have those laws too, because otherwise those people won't say anything.
Yeah.
So it's
Confidentiality.
It becomes this interesting gray area where if somebody really wants to harm someone, they have the wherewithal to hide that, then what test are you going to give them that's going to make up for it? It's going to cut through that somehow. So I think the idea that psychological testing could be effective in that realm is maybe a little idealistic, but it might be able to stop some. It might be able to stop some of them.
Unless there was a generalized psychological test that everyone had to go through, and then once you start seeing that kind of depression, then you say...
See, but I don't like psych exams en masse.
Yeah, the government
That concerns me.
demanding the psych
That's
exam.
kind of dangerous, right?
I don't know.
It's a tough
That would be
thing.
an interesting one to talk about.
Not that
I'd
they're
be
not
interested in
already
that.
going to be doing it just by analyzing our online behavior and shit. But
Right? God.
Dude, I think that teachers, I think that there is a vast amount more benefit that can happen for education than
I agree that there's a
negatives.
lot of benefit that could come from it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Here's
It's an
what-
authoritarian age we're entering, I fear. So.
Yeah.
It can
Maybe-
be for research and volunteer, but no way the government have control over everyone taking a psych exam.
Right.
I didn't say that. I meant for schooling and stuff like that.
I would be in favor of that if
Government's a
it
little
was
bit,
if it was like
questionable.
highly confidential but still, I mean, if that's on some database.
Well, if you have it
it's not like
trained,
the government wouldn't be able to take a peek.
but that's how all medical reports work.
That's true, and a lot of our medical information is sold by corporations and shit. So that's scary too.
That's
Yeah.
scary. I would say having a psychological test before you can have a gun is tricky. But what you may be able to do is if you have like say we have this license set up. If you have a gun license, then you're required to go to a certain number of counseling sessions in a given amount of time. Just like maybe even they're just once a year, like a check-in.
Yeah, I like.
And then if there's something that the psychologist sees that's maybe a little suspicious, they can require that you do more. And if you don't, then you lose your license. And then if there's some, like you could maybe set up some sort of criteria where if they really believe that you're going to harm somebody, then they get a second opinion. And then if that, they agree, then you can take it away. But it just gets really weird because, you have like, okay, what's the political bent of the psychologist involved? Like, are they liberal psychologists and they want to limit gun ownership? And then you have, just their fallibility in general, and so it's definitely a tricky area trying to limit one of those fundamental rights in that regard.
Yeah, real quick, I do want to touch on the whole civil liberty side of it because I tend to be someone who's far more in favor of like civil liberties and erring on the side of civil liberties in general. So, as far as that goes, I mean, I'm I'm in favor of revolution, albeit nonviolent. As far as like the right to bear arms, I have a hard time imagining any revolution in a modern context being successful in a violent way. I think it needs to be mass civil disobedience.
I agree.
The only way I see guns being necessary in a civil liberty versus a tyrannical government context would be if we've already been taken over by an authoritarian government and it's just about resistance now, physical resistance. So I'm not super worried about it in that lens, though I still want to protect the right of average citizens to keep guns. I'm not like a fervently on one side or the other there. And then there's this whole right-wing line that there's some conspiracy to take away our gun rights. And I don't buy that either, even though I'm generally very sensitive to civil liberty infringement. I think most of our civil liberty infringement has been a bipartisan project, whether it's freedom of speech or privacy, with spying and all these different things. I just don't think those in power care very much about guns one way or the other. I think they just use it as a political football. I think there's moneyed interests on one side that benefit off of this issue as a political issue. Every time there's a mass shooting, gun sales go way up, the NRA money goes way up. The NRA is a big supporter of Republican candidates, and then Democrats, channel the anger of these, events to channel support on the left. So the fact that it's so tribalistic as opposed to bipartisan makes me feel like those in power don't really care one way or the other. It's just a political game. So I don't buy that whole, it's a conspiracy to take our guns thing.
I mean, that's the Trump. You should just watch his most recent rally because he literally says the Democrats are going to take your guns,
he's been saying
referring
that
to
forever.
it to Nevada, and he uses it as a tool when it's just blatantly not true.
Well, there certainly are Democrats that want that.
True.
But it's also they're parroting to their own constituents.
Yeah.
And whether or not they would actually do that is another question. But to me, the argument for guns is not in the realm of trying to overthrow the government, but rather a basic right for self-defense.
Right, totally.
That's probably the most compelling to
Me
a
too.
wide
Yeah,
range of
I want
people,
to.
would
I want
say.
to be able to have a gun. I don't need it.
And-
Just a shotgun's fine for me, or whatever. Like I'd like to be able to defend myself.
I think a handgun is pretty important for self-defense.
Yeah.
If you really want to be an advocate for self-defense, then a handgun is probably your most important point that you wouldn't want to give up.
Yeah.
I think shotguns are
Great for
incredibly
home
good.
defense,
Incredibly
especially.
good for home defense.
Yeah.
And probably better than handguns in most cases. However, if you're in close quarters, it could be easier to take away, those kinds of things. So handguns kind of the be-all end-all of self-defense in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And I think, we're all guys here, but to be a woman in this world is a lot scarier in terms of what you face physically. Like I do a lot of jiu-jitsu, and so even if I'm unarmed and there's one person attacking me, I have a chance that, like if they're untrained, I'm probably going to beat them up, right? And I'm probably not horrifically weaker than them, and I probably don't, I'm not outweighed by probably more than, 50, 60 pounds maybe, unless they're really, really big, so it's definitely a different world when you start talking about, a 100-pound woman who is untrained in anything.
And unarmed.
Well, they're just targeted
And
more
so-
than I think.
Yeah, and
Oh,
that's
of
the
course.
other
Yeah,
thing is
it's
they're
not just
obviously
self-defense.
way more of a target.
Yeah.
And so the nice thing about guns is that 100-pound woman can kill a 260-pound man with
Right.
no effort at all, other than maybe some training, and definitely some training, I should say, and then being willing to do that. And so the equalizing part of it, I think, is just a huge compelling argument. And I think that saying that you want to take that away is allowing for a case where a woman can't defend her child, or like a lot of these things that could be solved by the right person having a gun in that instance. So that's one of the biggest arguments for guns that I have.
For sure.
Tangentially, I like to hunt. I think hunting is a much more sustainable way to eat meat, and so I think being able to hunt with a rifle or a bow that's something that I don't think we should take away either. Yeah. And it's one of those ways, going back to what we're talking about with the Native Americans, it's something that you can sort of get back to your roots in a lot of ways, and that whole cycle of providing for yourself and all that, it can be really beneficial for a lot of psychological reasons as well. So that would be why I would want to advocate for hunting weapons to be allowed as well. So those are my main arguments for.
I don't think very many people are worried about the hunting ones, because most of those are like single fire or.
Yeah, I mean, some automatic hunting rifles or shotguns, you could certainly make a case that you could do a lot with those,
But like
especially
most of
a
the
well-trained
shootings,
person.
like most of the mass shootings, and I feel like most of those are with not hunting style. Like you don't go hunting with
some
most of
people
those guns.
Yeah, well. Yeah, so the use of ARs in mass shootings is interesting, because in most cases the advantage of the AR is not really levied, right? So the advantage of a rifle over a pistol is distance. It's much easier to fire accurately at a long distance. Velocity doesn't really come into play that much.
Does it have more gunpowder in a rifle round?
Yes, for sure, but that's not to say that would matter that much, is what I'm saying. You can get plenty of velocity out of a handgun, and if you're within 50 yards, the killing potential is not very different, depending on the round. There are certainly rifles that you could pick that would be more devastating than your average handgun, but there's lots of handguns that are incredibly devastating, and if you pick the right round, you're not really looking at much of a difference, depending on, there's lots of factors involved, right? Yeah. Like, a rifle is more likely to go through, cover, so like wood, and that kind of thing, depending on the round. Again, that's something that a lot of people don't recognize, is the round makes a huge difference. So the type.
Aren't they making some laws against like hollow point? Because like hollow kills way more than a normal bullet, right?
What? Because
it expands in the body and it damages the body way more.
Right. I don't know about any laws that they're making about that. Obviously, the Geneva Convention prohibits the use of hollow points, and so what we do with our rounds that we use in the military is we make them just stable enough in their rotation that they will continue to travel in a stable and controlled manner until they hit something, in which point they tumble. And so they sort of increase the size of the wound by tumbling within somebody instead of fragmenting, which is actually more effective in a lot of cases because it can go through cover, whereas hollow point's really bad at going through anything.
Because
it'll just shatter once it hits something. So a hollow point is actually fundamentally safer in terms of ricochets because it's going to shatter when it hits something. And
you might get a little fragment, but that's fine.
Yeah. It might be, if you're right next to it, it might be like a little mini frag grenade, but it's probably not going to penetrate very far. If you get hit with a hollow point, however, it can be very, very devastating. So I don't know if they're trying to limit that. I would guess that they'd have a little hard time doing that if they were going to. But hollow points are not typically a hunting round either, so there is maybe some traction.
You're ruining the meat.
Yeah, and also you don't necessarily want a hollow point for killing an animal, because if you hit a deer in the shoulder with a hollow point, your bullet would fragment immediately without possibly going through any vital organs. So you essentially leave them with a surface wound instead of, if you had a soft point, it would probably break the bone and go through and kill the animal. Yeah. So it's just safer in terms of getting an ethical kill to use a soft point as your hunting round. And soft points will also mushroom a little bit. They just don't fragment in the same way. So anyway, as far as whether or not a rifle or a handgun is more deadly, there's a huge case to be made that a handgun would be worse for somebody to have than a rifle, because it's harder to take it away in a lot of cases, and much easier to conceal. Yeah. And you can have multiple handguns. You could have, like the Virginia Tech guy had 2. It wouldn't be that hard to have 4, you know. So then you're looking at mitigating the problem of reloading, whereas trying to carry even 2 ARs would be really cumbersome. So when people say that ARs are a big problem, it doesn't really resonate with me very much. You know, a lot of people say this based on the idea of, like, why would anyone ever need that, right? And I think that's a pretty compelling argument. There's only a few cases of self-defense, you know, where, like, multiple people are trying to come into your house or something, where you would need more than probably even 5 rounds. I would say 10 to be safe, especially if you're not overly well trained. But you know, if you have multiple attackers, you might want more than that. And then again, home defense with a shotgun is probably a better option anyway, because you don't have to be as accurate. So anyway, it's hard for me to argue that ARs are an integral part of self-defense, and it's hard for me to say that I see a compelling reason to keep them. But I also find a huge problem with the idea that banning them would help really at all, because I think they would just use handguns at that point.
Well, the thing is, it's a style of a gun. It's not really much different than any other rifle. Yeah.
They just look scary.
Yeah.
That's the biggest thing.
Here's a twist on the whole gun debate that I pretty much have never heard really talked about, but I've been thinking about a lot lately, is the history of, you know, in like totalitarian right-wing regimes using guns to, you know, use mob violence essentially to enforce totalitarian rule. So for example, in the United States, there's a long history of whipping up mobs of reactionary right-wing, you know, people to get their guns and go, you know, terrorize some political group. There's a long history of that in the United States. You have a lot of guns hoarded by a very small percentage of people in this country. We're seeing this right now play out in Brazil. So right now there's a fascist, Bolsonaro, and he's outwardly spoken about wanting to return to the former dictator. They've only had a democracy for a few decades, probably 30-something years.
It's been going great for him.
It was at first, and then there was a coup organized, like a soft coup organized by the wealthy business interests there to overthrow the elected president, put in a corporate puppet, made a bunch of things not work. Now the people are freaking out and they're falling into the hands of a demagogue. And they haven't had long to really cement any institutional norms of democracy. So, and Bolsonaro, he's talked about wanting guns to be available to everyone. and that we should directly eliminate, the scum of society and shit like that. There's this argument which the right ignores, which is the threat of guns being in the hands of mobs that are influenced by totalitarian regimes. So
there's also,
and I could see that really happening in this country if it got bad enough.
That's not certainly a scary thought.
So in Mexico,
I don't know there's a solution to that, but I'm just saying that concerns me.
there's groups of people in Mexico that are so fed up with the corrupt government and the cartel that they are taking their cities back. They're killing
arming
cartels.
themselves, and
So there's arguments on
goes
both
ways.
sides.
Yeah.
And I can see where you're scared about, right wing in the United States.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's both sides, and I don't know if it's a good enough argument to take guns.
I don't either, and I'm not advocating that, but I do think it's a point of discussion that's not usually brought up, and usually right-wingers will say that taking guns is a purely left-wing notion. Or what was I going to say? Anyway, I don't think that's acknowledged on the right, the threat of gun mobs in history, especially on the right.
I would agree it's not acknowledged. I think the fundamental problem with even trying to deal with that issue in the U.S. is just the ubiquity of guns.
Yeah.
So to propose any kind of buyback program or anything where you get rid of guns, I just don't think it's going to happen here anyway. So then to think that we could somehow curtail the problem of possible mob violence, I just don't see a path forward.
My point I was going to make is that on the right, there's a talking point that authoritarian governments will always try to take away your guns, but we have examples of exactly the opposite as well, where they want people to have guns so they can rile up vigilante mobs to do the dirty work so they don't have to.
Well, it's become very different now that guns are not the be-all, end-all of war.
Right.
Back in the World War II era, even, if you had a mob of people with guns, they were the same guns that were being used in War One, and they could make a huge difference if they wanted to. But now, one Apache just fucks your whole mob up with 2 rockets, and there's no recourse unless you have a 50 BMG and a ridiculously well-trained shooter.
Yeah.
I think the idea is guerrilla warfare. Like, if we were taken
that
over
possibility,
where
but
it
then
was
you have
so bad.
thermal vision and drones.
But it'd be the same thing. It's the problems that we're dealing in the Middle East.
Yeah,
it's why it's
it
so
should
hard
be
to
said
fight
that-
those people, because they conceal the guns, they shoot up a bunch of things, and then they hide their guns and
pretend to
hide.
be civilians.
There is more to be said for guerrilla warfare than I think we give it credit
So
for.
in a that's why it's so hard to fight.
But still.
Yeah, I'm pretty much on the ship of I want all the guns. I would personally love to have a fully automatic gun at some point, and I don't know if I'll go through the rigmarole to do it. But I also really like the idea of having suppressors, just because they're cool and they sound like it makes it so that it's much quieter when you shoot, which is just nice. But
obviously that has concerning implications, though.
Yeah, it could. Although I wouldn't necessarily say that having a suppressor should be as big of a deal as we make it out to be. Because
it's a lot louder than it is in the movies.
Yeah, it's much louder. And anyway, that's a whole other discussion. And but I'm not hard and fast on these things. I'm not saying that I want to re-legalize fully automatic weapons or anything, but I do like ARs a lot, and I would like to have some, and I like the idea of being ready for the zombie apocalypse and whatever. Not to say that I'll have my own bunker or anything like that, but I understand the mentality, and I understand the idea that maybe if shit really did hit the fan, it'd be nice to think that you could possibly have some sort of recourse, and so fundamentally what it comes down to, though, is what would be the effectiveness of not letting that happen, of limiting ARs and all these other types of guns. And I don't see the case of the effectiveness of limitation being very compelling. I really don't. I think a good enough person with a bow could cause pretty big harm. And we've seen people in China go into schools and attack them with knives, and they've killed as many people in some cases as some of these school shootings. Obviously, knives are nowhere near as effective as guns, but to think that getting rid of the gun gets rid of the problem is pretty silly.
I agree, but I think there's some there's some middle ground. I don't think we should be handing out automatic ARs to people if they want one. I think there still needs to be the checks.
Yep.
And yeah, you can still cause damage with a bow, with a knife, with a car, with what, but like a gun is one of the easiest ways to cause a lot of damage. So if we can put a check on that and then have as many people, good citizens, having concealed carry, and then have checks that people have to go through before buying a gun.
Yeah. I definitely think there's something to be said about that. I do think Sam Harris has another good point on this where, when we look at the deaths due to car accidents, they're pretty high, right? And we look at, I think they're like 30,000 a year, every year reliably, according to him at least. I didn't check his number. But that's quite a bit higher than gun violence. And we kind of just accept that. We're just like, well, it is what it is, When if we really looked at it, we could govern all cars and make it so that they can't accelerate past a certain rate, or that they couldn't have a top speed past a certain speed, and we could even lower speed limits in almost everywhere, and we could govern cars to even lower speed limits, and we could definitely reduce that number of deaths. There's 100%. But essentially, people's reasoning for not doing that is driving wouldn't be as fun, right? Like, what's the reason that we don't do that? And so then when we look at trying to limit gun violence, which is a smaller amount of violence, and it's kind of like, where's the moral equivalence there, I think there's definitely something to be said about that, where we sort of misattribute violence and problems, and we kind of forget about the statistics, right? Because guns are so in your face and nasty and scary, So anyway, I just think
that's almost the reverse of his argument from earlier, because you have
That's exactly the reverse.
you have cars
That's what I heard.
you have cars killing people accidentally, and then you have guns killing people on purpose, or people using guns to kill people on purpose.
Yeah.
So I think there's certainly something more shocking, more morally outrageous about that.
I guess
especially
you're
when
right.
it has to do with young children.
You're right. Moral equivalence is the wrong word, but I guess the idea that that gun violence is the biggest problem,
Right.
or is a bigger problem than that, and to think that I'm taking this argument a little bit out of context, so like I'm not steel manning him properly, but to say that you're willing to limit guns just because like you don't want somebody to have an AR because they want the AR because they're fun, but you're willing to drive faster and not limit people's ability to do that because it's fun. It's different,
Right.
obviously,
Right.
but the fact that we're not willing to limit those things, but we're so eager to limit guns is I don't know, it just seems like kind of a double standard.
We do limit those things,
Yeah,
though.
we got speed
Well,
limits.
to be fair, we
we
do limit
try.
those things way
We
more
try.
than guns right now.
But I mean, Dwight
That's true.
did just,
Talking
like,
about
there's a
licenses
good
again.
point. Like, you could literally limit the amount of speed a car can go,
Yeah.
but we don't do it.
Yeah.
We could say you can't go over 80 miles an hour.
Yeah.
I've argued that, and I also think that that's probably gonna happen when we get electric cars.
Right.
Except it's gonna be, not electric.
Well,
sorry,
well,
Self-driving is...
If we fully
then they'll go
automate
faster.
driving,
Exactly.
we go way faster.
Exactly. But the idea would be like it's the mistakes.
Yeah.
It's mistakes that
Yeah.
lead to the car deaths.
Yeah, and so I don't want to misrepresent him or my own ideas with that. I'm not saying that they are morally equivalent. I shouldn't have said that.
We just need guns that are programmed to only kill bad guys,
There you go.
and then we're good.
Easy.
Perfect
right?
moral arbiter. Great.
Yeah. Anyway, there's definitely
Read the face of the enemy to see if they're
Fucking
evil or
right.
not.
Exactly. No, see, this is where the psychological reports from earlier.
there we
work
go.
Really well. Like this one.
They
has
can
high
have a
tendency.
score. They can have a moral score
Exactly.
that pops up above their head inside the gun sight.
It's like the Black Mirror episode of like everyone
Or like
walking
what
around
they're doing in
society
China right
with
now in real life.
Yeah.
a rating.
It's crazy.
Yep.
But yeah, anyway, I would say just as like a last part of that, I'm not against gun legislation as a whole. I just think it needs to be done intelligently, and we need to look at it in the broader context of like, what are we trying to do? Will it be effective? And what other things should we be trying to do that are possibly even more impactful? I think getting outraged about school shootings and that kind of thing makes a ton of sense, and it's something that's super visceral to people, and it should be like it's crazy. But I think looking at mental health and the media and possibly having guards around there are going to be way more effective methods of curtailing that type of violence than going after the guns.
And I would like to put the impetus on those in favor of gun ownership to be more active in calling for measures that you think actually make sense.
Yeah.
And because in lieu of that, those who don't know stuff are, rightly going to be emotionally outraged and demanding action. And so those who know the most about the issue should be the most active to ensure that it's done in a logical way.
Definitely.
So
I think
all that push for research, push for reforms that make sense. Don't be falling into the political playbook of the tribalism.
I think both sides need to be a lot better about that in general, and they need to be a lot better about coming together and talking about it and coming to an agreement on something. Because, like with the instance of gun control, we have Democrats that are just saying, "Oh, we need to pick your part of the gun," and they'll throw out anything. They'll be like, "We shouldn't have guns with silver slides," and it's like, has nothing to do.
And then
with
on the
anything.
right, you have Republicans being like, "Oh, Democrats want to take your guns so they can put you in Walmart concentration camps."
But my point was just that when you have Democrats throwing out crazy legislation like that, then they make the conservatives, the people that actually know about guns, mad because they recognize immediately that it's not going to do anything. And so then you just have this fighting that happens as opposed to coming together and being like, okay, what's actually going to help? And being reasonable about those types of things. And I know a lot of gun owners that are more than willing to look at the holes in gun ownership, but they hate when somebody proposes legislation out of this moral framework, thinking that they know and that like they can understand this, and that them having a gun is this huge moral outrage. When they've never even shot one, they don't understand anything about it.
So many of our issues boil down to having a two-party system that's captured by corporate power, and we don't have functioning institutions anymore. We don't have institutions that respond to the problems we face or that listen to the will of the people. So shit's got to change big, guys. It's got to change real big.